The body's eyes followed me across the room. 3 hours after the doctor pronounced him dead, what you're about to hear are 12 true encounters from priests who walked among the graves when darkness falls. These aren't legends. These are testimonies from men of faith who confronted forces that no seminary prepared them for. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is real. Now get ready, let's start story 1. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. It was 2:17 a.m. when my phone shattered the rectory silence. "Father, please, you have to come to the cemetery. There's someone here who won't leave." The groundskeeper's voice trembled like autumn leaves in a winter wind. I'd served Holy Cross Parish for 15 years, but I'd never received a call like this. 20 minutes later, I stood beside Marcus, our night groundskeeper, watching his flashlight beam dance across weathered marble angels. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the old mausoleum section. "She's been kneeling there for 3 hours. Won't respond when I call out." The fog hung thick that October night, transforming familiar monuments into grotesque shadows. Each step toward the figure felt like walking through cold honey, the air growing denser with each breath. My rosary beads clicked softly in my pocket, a comforting rhythm against the oppressive silence. As we approached, I could see her clearly. A woman in a white dress, kneeling before a weathered tombstone. Her long hair cascaded down her back, obscuring her face, as she whispered words I couldn't quite catch. The strange thing was, despite the dampness soaking everything else, her dress remained pristine, almost luminous in the darkness. "Mom?" I called softly. "The cemetery is closed. Can I help you?" She didn't acknowledge me. Her whispers continued, urgent and rhythmic, like prayers spoken in desperation. Marcus grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my coat sleeve. "Father, look at the ground around her." That's when I noticed it. The grass beneath her knees was completely dry, forming a perfect circle of untouched earth in the otherwise dew-soaked cemetery. The temperature around her seemed warmer, as if she carried her own climate. My breath misted in the cold air, but hers, there was no visible breath at all. I knelt beside her, close enough to hear her words clearly now. She was reciting the act of contrition, but in Latin, the old form that hadn't been used in decades. Her voice was melodic yet hollow, like an echo from a deep well. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," she repeated over and over. The tombstone before her was cracked down the middle, the inscription barely legible. Margaret O'Sullivan, 1892-1918, beloved wife and mother. Below it, smaller text read, "Died in the influenza pandemic, unconfessed." I reached out to touch her shoulder, offering comfort. The moment my fingers made contact, she turned toward me. Where her face should have been was nothing but shadow, a void that seemed to pull light into itself. Yet somehow I could feel her gratitude, her desperate need for absolution. "I can hear your confession," I whispered, my training overriding my terror. The words came automatically, muscle memory from thousands of similar moments in the safety of the confessional booth. But this wasn't safe, this wasn't normal, and yet it felt like the most important sacrament I'd ever performed. She began to speak, and her story poured out like water through a broken dam. Margaret O'Sullivan had died alone in 1918, burning with fever, calling for a priest who never came. The pandemic had overwhelmed the city. There weren't enough clergy to reach everyone in time. She died with unconfessed sins weighing on her soul, believing herself damned. As she spoke, the temperature plummeted, my breath came in sharp puffs, and frost began forming on the nearby headstones. Marcus had backed away, crossing himself repeatedly, but I remained transfixed. Her confession wasn't just words, it was images flooding my mind. I saw her life, a young mother struggling to feed her children, stealing bread from the church pantry. Small sins born of desperation, but they'd grown monstrous in her mind during her feverish final hours. "I took from God's house," she whispered, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I fed my babies with stolen bread. I died believing I was forsaken. The shadows around her began to writhe, forming shapes of other figures. More souls, I realized. All of them unconfessed, all of them trapped by their final moments of despair. The ground beneath us started to vibrate, a low humming that I felt in my bones. The other figures drew closer, their own stories pressing against my consciousness. A man who'd hidden his homosexuality in an era when it meant damnation. A teenage girl who died by suicide, convinced she was beyond salvation. An elderly woman who'd harbored resentment against her abusive husband until her dying breath. Each soul carried the weight of unspoken confessions, final moments clouded by fear and guilt. They'd been trapped here in the space between worlds, unable to move on without the absolution they'd been denied in life. The church taught that perfect contrition could grant forgiveness even without formal confession, but these souls had died in imperfect states, afraid, alone, convinced of their damnation. The rules, Margaret's voice cut through my thoughts, they kept us bound. The fear of judgment kept us from seeking mercy. Her shadowed face turned toward me, and I could feel the weight of a century's worth of desperation. You can free us, Father. You have the authority. I understood what she was asking. These souls needed formal absolution, the sacramental words that would release them from their self-imposed prison. But could I absolve the dead? Was it theologically sound? My seminary training warred with the evidence before my eyes. The other figures pressed closer, their collective need creating a pressure that made my ears pop. I could smell the dampness of decay, not from their bodies, but from the centuries of stagnant spiritual energy they generated. Their whispered pleas overlapped. Father, please. I've been waiting. The guilt burns. Marcus had fled entirely now, leaving me alone with these desperate souls. The cemetery had become a courtroom, and I was the judge they'd been waiting for. But what if I was wrong? What if this was a test? Or worse, a deception? The shadowed faces showed no malice, only an exhaustion so profound it made my chest ache. Tell me your sins, I said finally, my voice stronger than I felt. All of you. I will hear every confession that was left unspoken. What followed was the longest night of my life. One by one, 37 souls approached me, each carrying confessions that had festered for decades or centuries. I heard stories of human frailty that spanned generations, adultery, theft, violence, despair, but more than that, I heard the deeper truth, how fear of judgment had kept them from seeking the mercy that was always available. As dawn approached, I spoke the words of absolution for each soul. Ego te absolvo a peccatis tuis, in nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. With each blessing, a figure would fade, their posture straightening as if an enormous weight had been lifted. Margaret was the last to go. Thank you, Father, she whispered, and for the first time I could see her face clearly. She was young, perhaps 25, with kind eyes that sparkled with unshed tears of gratitude. We were so afraid that God had forgotten us, but mercy was there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to offer it. As she faded, the first rays of sunlight pierced the fog. The cemetery returned to normal, but I was forever changed. I'd learned that the church's role wasn't to guard grace like a treasure, but to pour it out freely to anyone who needed it, living or dead. But here's what haunts me most. As I walked back toward the rectory, I heard my phone buzzing. Text messages, dozens of them, all from numbers I didn't recognize. Thank you, Father. Peace at last. The word is spreading. Since that night, I've received calls from cemeteries across New England. Groundskeepers reporting figures kneeling by graves, whispering confessions to the wind. Word had somehow spread through whatever realm these souls inhabit. They know now that mercy is possible, that someone will listen. I've become an unofficial chaplain to the dead, visiting cemeteries where restless souls gather. Each confession I hear reveals the same truth. Most spirits aren't malevolent, they're simply afraid, carrying guilt that church doctrine sometimes intensified rather than healed. The church hierarchy doesn't officially acknowledge my work, but they don't stop me either. Perhaps they understand that mercy shouldn't be limited by the boundaries between life and death. Or perhaps they're afraid of what might happen if these souls remain unheard. Sometimes I wonder if I've opened a door that should have stayed closed. The messages continue and the calls multiply. But when I see the peace that settles over a soul finally granted absolution, I know I'm doing God's work, even if it's work that no living congregation will ever witness. Now get ready, let's start story 2, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The laughter started at exactly 3:33 a.m., just like Mrs. Chen had warned me it would. High-pitched giggles echoing across Sunshine Memorial Cemetery's children's section, where 200 young souls rested beneath pastel headstones decorated with teddy bears and rainbow angels. But this wasn't the joyful sound of children at play. This was something else entirely. I'd been called to investigate reports of supernatural disturbances in the pediatric section of Phoenix's oldest cemetery. 5 different night security guards had quit in the past month, all reporting the same phenomena: children's voices singing nursery rhymes, the sound of playground equipment that had been removed decades ago, and small handprints appearing on freshly washed mausoleums. Standing at the entrance to the children's area, I clutched my blessed medallion and tried to steady my breathing. The desert air was dry and cool, typical for November in Arizona, but there was something else in the atmosphere, a sweetness, like cotton candy and birthday cake, that had no business existing in a graveyard at nearly 4 a.m. The first giggle came from my left, near a cluster of small headstones marked with dates from the 1950s. Then another laugh, higher pitched from the opposite direction. Soon the air filled with the sound of phantom children, their voices creating a symphony of innocence that made my skin crawl, because I knew, absolutely knew, that no living children were present. I followed a winding path through the memorial garden, past tiny graves marked with toys that families had left behind. A red fire truck on Jimmy Martinez's plot. A porcelain doll guarding Sarah Beth Williams' resting place. As I walked, the toys began to rattle softly, as if touched by invisible hands. "Hello?" I called out, feeling somewhat foolish but needing to establish communication. "I'm Father Rodriguez. I'm here to help if you need someone to talk to." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt vacuum-sealed. Then, from behind a marble angel statue, a small voice spoke. "Are you here to play with us, Father? We've been so lonely." I turned toward the voice and saw her, a little girl in a blue dress with blonde pigtails, maybe 6 years old. She stood beside a headstone that read, "Emily Rose Patterson, age 6, taken too soon." But Emily Rose wasn't solid. I could see the desert mountains through her translucent form, and her feet didn't quite touch the ground. "Hello, Emily," I said gently, the way I'd learned to speak with children during my hospital chaplaincy training. "How long have you been here?" "Since the bad medicine," she replied matter-of-factly. "Mommy said it would make me better, but it made me go to sleep instead. When I woke up, I was here, and Mommy couldn't see me anymore." Her expression was curious rather than sad, but there was something ancient in her eyes that no 6-year-old should possess. More children began appearing around the memorial garden. A boy in cowboy pajamas materialized near a headstone marked Thomas Chen, age 4. Twin girls in matching white dresses stood hand in hand beside graves that bore their names and the same death date. Within minutes, I was surrounded by 24 spectral children, all looking at me with expressions of hope mixed with wariness. "We tried talking to the other grown-ups," explained Tommy, the boy in cowboy pajamas, "but they just run away screaming. It hurts our feelings." The other children nodded solemnly, their ethereal forms flickering like candle flames in a gentle breeze. I realized I was looking at victims of what locals called Black Summer, the polio outbreak of 1952 that had claimed over 200 children in the Phoenix area before vaccines became widely available. These souls had been here for 70 years, trapped in the eternal childhood of their final moments, unaware that the world had moved on without them. "Would you like to play a game?" Emily asked, her voice carrying an odd echo, as if she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "We know lots of games. We've had so much time to learn new ones." The other children gathered closer, their excitement palpable despite their incorporeal state. But as they drew near, the temperature plummeted. My breath began to mist, and frost started forming on the metal surfaces of nearby headstones. The children didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they couldn't feel the cold that their presence generated. "Red light! Green light!" shouted Tommy, clapping his translucent hands together. "Father can be it first." Without waiting for my response, the children scattered among the tombstones, their giggles echoing off marble surfaces in ways that defied acoustic logic. I found myself reluctantly participating, calling out, "Green light!" and watching the spectral children dart between graves with unnatural speed. When I called red light, they froze in positions that hurt to look at, suspended in mid-air, twisted at impossible angles, their forms becoming more transparent with each round. But something was wrong with this game. Each time I called red light, the children remained frozen a little longer than they should have. Their smiles grew wider, stretching beyond the normal limits of human facial structure. And their eyes began to reflect a hunger that had nothing to do with childhood innocence. "My turn to be it," Emily announced, her voice now carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Close your eyes and count to 10, Father. We'll hide, and you try to find us." I closed my eyes, but immediately felt movement around me, not the playful scampering of children, but something more purposeful. The air grew thick with whispers in languages I didn't recognize, and I could feel tiny fingers brushing against my clothes, my hair, my skin. The touches were cold, so cold they burned. When I opened my eyes at 10, the children had vanished. The cemetery was empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic from the nearby highway. But their voices continued to echo from every direction. "Come find us, Father. We're hiding in the special place." Following the sounds, I found myself drawn toward the center of the children's section, where an old maintenance shed stood partially hidden behind overgrown oleander bushes. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up and its door secured with a rusty chain and padlock. But the chain hung loose now, the padlock open despite having been welded shut, according to the cemetery records. Inside the shed, the smell hit me first. Not decay, but something sweeter and more disturbing, like birthday cake left to rot in summer heat. Emergency lanterns flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their light sources. And there, arranged in a circle on the dirt floor, were the children, but they weren't playing anymore. They sat motionless, staring at something in the center of their circle, a hospital bed, rusted and stained, with leather restraints hanging from its rails. On the bed lay medical equipment from the 1950s, iron lungs, oxygen tents, injection needles that looked more like torture devices than healing instruments. "This is where they brought us when we got too sick," Emily said, her voice now carrying the weight of accumulated decades. "The bad medicine place. They said it would help, but it only made us go to sleep forever." The other children nodded in unison, their movements synchronized in a way that living children never managed. "We remember everything now," said Tommy, "how they tied us down when we cried for our mummies. How the needles hurt, how we called for God to make it stop, but he didn't answer. I understood then that I wasn't dealing with innocent souls. These children had been traumatized not just by death, but by the medical procedures of an era when pediatric care was more about restraint than comfort. Their innocence had been corrupted by pain, transforming their spiritual energy into something darker. We learned new games while we waited, Emily continued, her smile now extending beyond the boundaries of her face. Games about making the hurt stop. Games about sharing the quiet sleep. Would you like to learn our games, Father? The medical equipment began to hum with phantom electricity, restraints uncoiled like snakes, reaching toward me with purposeful intent. The children's laughter returned, but now it carried undertones of hysteria and rage that no child should ever experience. I realized that these weren't lost souls seeking comfort. They were collectors, gathering adults to join their eternal game of medical horror. The security guards hadn't quit from fear. They'd been taken, added to the collection of playmates who could understand their suffering. "You want to help us feel better, don't you, Father?" Emily asked, her head tilting at an angle that would have snapped a living child's neck. The bad medicine made us sleep, but we found a way to stay awake. Now we can help others sleep too. The restraints on the hospital bed began moving with increasing purpose, supported by invisible hands. I could see the rust stains on the leather. Not rust, I realized, but something far worse. These children had been using their supernatural abilities to recreate their trauma, binding visitors to the bed and subjecting them to phantom medical procedures until their sanity shattered. "We don't want to hurt you," Tommy said, his cowboy pajamas now stained with substances that shouldn't exist on a spirit. "We just want you to understand. The grown-ups who gave us the bad medicine, they said it was for our own good. Now we give the quiet sleep to other grown-ups for their own good." I understood the terrible logic. These children had been so traumatized by medical intervention that they'd become perpetrators of the same violence, convinced they were helping. Their innocent desire to heal had been perverted into a compulsion to share their suffering. But I also recognized an opportunity. "Emily," I said gently, "what if I told you that the medicine today is different? The children don't have to be hurt anymore to get better." Her translucent form flickered with confusion. But the needles always hurt. The machines always make the bad dreams come. I pulled out my phone and showed them pictures I'd taken at Phoenix Children's Hospital the week before. Smiling young patients playing video games during chemotherapy, colorful treatment rooms designed to reduce anxiety, parents staying beside their children throughout procedures. "Medicine learned to be kinder," I explained. "The doctors who hurt you, they thought they were helping, but they were wrong. We learned better ways." The children gathered around my phone, their ethereal forms pressing close as they stared at images of modern pediatric care. I saw wonder replace the hunger in their eyes, confusion melting the rictus grins they'd worn. "The children in these pictures," whispered one of the twin girls, "they don't look scared." "Because they're not tied down," added her sister. "Their mommies are right there with them." Emily's form began to solidify slightly, becoming more childlike and less monstrous. We thought all medicine was bad medicine. We thought we were protecting people from the hurt. I knelt to their level, speaking with the same gentle authority I used during children's masses. "You were trying to help, but you were remembering the old hurt instead of making new healing. The best way to honor your pain is to make sure other children never experience what you did." The medical equipment in the shed began to rust and crumble at an accelerated rate, decades of supernatural preservation finally giving way to natural decay. The restraints fell apart, the needles turned to dust, and the hospital bed collapsed into a pile of corroded metal. "What should we do now?" asked Tommy, his cowboy pajamas returning to their original bright colors. "Rest," I said simply. "Your job is done. Medicine is kinder now because people learned from what happened to you. You can sleep peacefully, knowing that children today are safer because of the lessons learned from your suffering." One by one, the children began to fade, their forms becoming lighter and more translucent. But this time, their disappearance felt like release rather than retreat. Emily was the last to go, pausing to smile at me with genuine childhood sweetness. "Thank you for showing us the good medicine," she said. We were so scared that nothing had changed. Now we can dream good dreams instead of playing the hurt games. As dawn broke over the desert, I stood alone in the children's section of Sunshine Memorial Cemetery. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by the peaceful quiet that should characterize a place of rest. But I wasn't unchanged by the encounter. Since that night, I've made it my mission to visit pediatric wards, blessing the spaces where children receive treatment, and praying that medicine continues to evolve toward compassion. Because sometimes the most important healing happens not through medicine, but through understanding that today's children deserve better than yesterday's pain. Now get ready. Let's start story 3, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The consecrated host crumbled to ash in my hands the moment I stepped through the cemetery gates. I stared at the grey powder falling between my fingers, watching sacred bread that had been blessed hours earlier reduced to nothing more than dust and memory. Father McKenna had warned me this might happen, but experiencing it firsthand sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with Kentucky's November wind. Mount Calvary Cemetery had been calling priests for help for 3 weeks. Not through official channels, the church hierarchy remained skeptically silent on the matter. Instead, the calls came through whispered conversations in confessionals, desperate letters slipped under rectory doors, and late-night phone calls from faithful parishioners who could no longer ignore what they were witnessing. "They gather at midnight," Mrs. Patterson had told me during her confession. "The dead ones, Father. They kneel in rows like they're at Mass, but there's no altar, no priest. They just wait, and the sounds they make. It's not singing, Father. It's something else." I dismissed it as the fantasies of an elderly woman dealing with grief. Her husband had been buried at Mount Calvary just 2 months prior. But then came similar reports from other parishioners, all describing the same phenomenon. Spectral figures arranging themselves in the cemetery's central clearing, participating in what appeared to be a ghostly mass. The groundskeeper, a practical man named Bill Henderson, had been the most convincing witness. "I've worked cemeteries for 30 years, he'd told me over coffee. "I know what normal looks like, and this ain't it. They're organized, Father, like they're following a liturgy we can't hear." So here I stood at 11:47 p.m., clutching my portable communion kit and a blessed candle that had already begun flickering despite the absence of wind. The cemetery stretched before me in rolling hills of marble and granite, punctuated by elaborate mausoleums that cast strange shadows in the moonlight. As I walked the main path toward the reported gathering area, I began to notice subtle signs of supernatural activity. Flowers on graves that had been dead that morning now bloomed with impossible vibrancy. Headstones that should have been covered in autumn leaves were pristine, as if invisible hands had carefully tended to them. And the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping cemetery, but the expectant hush of a congregation waiting for service to begin. The first figure appeared as I crested the hill overlooking the central clearing. An elderly woman in a 1940s dress knelt before an empty space where an altar might have stood, her head bowed in prayer. Her form was translucent but distinct, and I could see her lips moving in silent devotion. As I drew closer, more figures materialized. They filled the clearing in orderly rows, perhaps 200 souls in various states of spiritual manifestation. Some appeared solid enough to cast shadows, while others were mere suggestions of humanity, visible only as shimmers in the air. But all of them were focused on the same empty space, waiting with patient expectation. I recognized the arrangement immediately. It was the traditional layout of a pre-Vatican II Mass, with the congregation facing east toward an altar that existed only in their collective memory. These souls had died before the liturgical reforms of the 1960s, and they continued to worship in the style they'd known in life. "Excuse me," I whispered to the nearest figure, an old man in a worn suit who knelt at the end of a row. "I'm Father O'Brien. Can you hear me?" He turned slowly, his face showing surprise and relief in equal measure. "Father?" His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like an echo in a cathedral. "We've been waiting for so long. We gather every night, but there's no priest to say the Mass. We remember the responses, but we need someone to speak the consecration." The magnitude of what I was witnessing hit me like a physical blow. These souls had been gathering nightly for decades, possibly longer, reenacting the central mystery of their faith, but unable to complete it without a living priest to perform the consecration. They were trapped in spiritual limbo, not by sin or unfinished business, but by their deep need for the Eucharist. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked. "Since we learned to remember," replied a woman in the front row, turning to face me with eyes that held decades of patient suffering. "We died, knowing we needed the body and blood, but there was no priest here to provide it. So we wait, and we pray, and we hope that someday someone will complete what we cannot finish ourselves." The weight of their collective need pressed against my consciousness like a physical force. 200 souls, maybe more, all focused on me with an intensity that made my ears ring. They weren't demanding or threatening. Their spiritual presence carried only hope and desperate faith, but the pressure of their combined longing was almost unbearable. "We remember everything," explained the elderly man in the worn suit. "The Latin responses, the proper postures, even the seasonal variations in the liturgy. But memory alone cannot transform bread and wine. For that, we need—" He gestured toward me, and I understood the terrible weight of what he was asking. These souls wanted me to celebrate Mass for the dead. Not a memorial service or a prayer for the departed, but actual Mass, with consecration and communion, for congregants who existed only in spiritual form. My seminary training had never addressed such a scenario. Was it even possible? Could the Eucharist be valid if offered to souls who had no physical bodies to receive it? "Father," called a young woman from the middle rows, "we hunger for the sacrament. In life, we were devout. We attended daily Mass when we could. We fasted properly. We prepared our souls. But death came suddenly for many of us. Accidents, heart attacks, strokes. We died in a state of grace, but without final communion." More voices joined hers, creating a chorus of spiritual longing that resonated in frequencies I felt rather than heard. "We tried to receive from visiting priests," said an older woman, "but the living cannot see us clearly. The hosts fall through our hands like light through glass." I began to understand the cruel irony of their situation. In life, these had been the most faithful Catholics, the daily Mass attendees, the Eucharistic ministers, the souls whose spiritual lives revolved around the sacrament. But death had severed their connection to the physical reality of bread and wine, leaving them able to remember and desire communion without being able to receive it. "Show me how you remember," I said, curious about the mechanics of their ghostly liturgy. Immediately they arranged themselves with military precision. The elderly man I'd first spoken to stepped forward, assuming the role of altar server. He began the Latin prayers that had opened Mass for centuries before the vernacular reforms. "In troibo ad altare Dei." The congregation responded in perfect unison, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. But as they progressed through the familiar prayers, I noticed troubling changes. The temperature around us plummeted with each Latin phrase. Frost began forming on the nearby headstones, and the empty space where their imagined altar stood began to shimmer with an energy that made my eyes water. Something was manifesting in response to their collective faith and need. Not something holy. I could feel that immediately. The energy crackling in the air carried undertones of hunger and desperation that had nothing to do with divine grace. These souls' prolonged spiritual longing had attracted something else, something that fed on religious devotion and twisted it to darker purposes. "Stop!" I commanded, my voice cutting through their prayers. "Stop the service!" But they couldn't hear me. Or perhaps they wouldn't. Their voices continued, growing louder and more desperate as they progressed through the liturgy. The man acting as server began pantomiming the preparation of non-existent hosts, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. The shimmering over their phantom altar intensified, and I began to see shapes forming in the distortion, not the sacred imagery one might expect, but writhing forms that hurt to look at directly. Whatever these souls had been summoning night after night through their incomplete liturgy, it was finally responding to their calls. "We need the consecration!" the server cried out, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "We need the transformation! The bread and wine must become flesh and blood." I realized with growing horror that they weren't trying to celebrate Mass anymore. They were trying to create a communion, using their own spiritual essence as the elements. Their desperate need for the Eucharist had perverted into something that sought to cannibalize their own souls, offering themselves as both priest and sacrifice. The forms above their altar were becoming clearer now, revealing themselves as entities that existed to consume spiritual energy. These things had been feeding on the soul's nightly attempts at worship, growing stronger with each incomplete Mass, while simultaneously driving the dead congregation toward more desperate attempts at consecration. I understood now why the consecrated host had crumbled when I entered the cemetery. The entities feeding on these souls' perverted worship had created a zone where genuine sacred energy couldn't survive. They had been slowly corrupting the spiritual atmosphere, transforming authentic religious longing into something that served their appetite for souls. "You're not celebrating Mass," I called out over their increasingly frantic prayers. "You're feeding something that wants to devour you." The server turned toward me, and I saw that his face was no longer human. His features had elongated, his mouth stretching wider than anatomy should allow, filled with too many teeth. "The consecration demands sacrifice," he hissed. "If we cannot receive the body and blood, we must become the body and blood." The other souls continued their responses, but their forms were changing too. They were becoming more translucent with each prayer, their spiritual essence being drawn upward toward the writhing Mass above their phantom altar. They were literally consuming themselves in a twisted parody of communion, offering their souls as both host and wine to entities that understood only hunger. I pulled out my portable communion kit, removing a consecrated host that I'd blessed that morning in my own church. The moment the sacred bread touched the cemetery air, it began to glow with warm golden light. The entities above the altar recoiled from the radiance, their forms becoming less distinct. "This is consecration," I declared, holding the host high enough for all the souls to see. "This is the true body of Christ, blessed in a sanctuary where love and sacrifice are united in service, not separated by hunger." The souls' desperate prayers faltered as they turned toward the genuine Eucharist. I could see recognition dawning in their faces. This was what they had been trying to recreate, but their isolation and desperation had led them away from grace and towards something that mocked it. "We remember now," whispered the woman in the front row, her form stabilizing as she spoke. "We remember the difference between hunger and hope." I began the proper prayers of communion, offering the Eucharist to souls who could finally receive it spiritually, if not physically. As each soul participated in genuine communion, not consuming the host, but joining in the mystical reality it represented, the entities above their altar began to dissolve. "Forgive us, Father," said the server, his face returning to human proportions as the corruption left him. "We wanted so desperately to be close to God that we allowed our need to become its own idol." One by one, the souls began to fade, but this time their departure felt like completion rather than consumption. They were moving on, their spiritual hunger finally satisfied through proper communion. The elderly man who had first spoken to me was among the last to go. "Thank you for showing us the difference between faith and need," he said. "We had confused wanting God with trying to possess God. True communion means letting go, not holding on. As dawn broke over Mount Calvary Cemetery, I stood alone in the central clearing. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by the peaceful quiet that should characterize consecrated ground. But the experience had changed my understanding of both faith and death. I realized that the greatest spiritual danger isn't the absence of faith, but faith that has become distorted by desperation. These souls had loved God so deeply that their separation from the Eucharist had driven them to create a false communion that served only to feed their spiritual hunger rather than satisfy it. Since that night, I've made it a practice to celebrate Mass regularly in cemeteries, offering communion for any souls who might be trapped by spiritual longing. But I've also learned to recognize the signs of corrupted worship. Since that night, I've made it a practice to celebrate Mass regularly in cemeteries, offering communion for any souls who might be trapped by spiritual longing. But I've also learned to recognize the signs of corrupted worship, the cold spots that repel rather than welcome, the prayers that echo with hunger instead of gratitude, the spiritual energy that seeks to consume rather than transform. The Church has quietly acknowledged my work, though no official doctrine addresses communion with the dead. Perhaps some truths are too complex for doctrine, requiring instead the discernment that comes from direct encounter with mystery. What I learned at Mount Calvary is that faith itself can become a trap when it transforms from surrender into grasping. But here's what haunts me most. Sometimes, during the consecration at regular Sunday Mass, I'll glimpse translucent figures kneeling among my living parishioners. They're different from the desperate souls I met at Mount Calvary. These spirits radiate peace, participating in communion without the frantic need that had corrupted the cemetery congregation. I've come to believe that proper spiritual hunger draws souls toward authentic grace, while corrupted longing attracts entities that feed on religious desperation. The difference lies not in the intensity of faith, but in whether that faith seeks to receive God's love or to possess it. Now get ready, let's start story 4, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The confession booth materialized in the cemetery at exactly 3 a.m., just as the letter had warned me it would. Not metaphorically, not as some spiritual vision, but physically manifested between two weathered mausoleums like it had always been there. Ornate Victorian woodwork, purple velvet curtains, brass fixtures that gleamed despite the humidity. It looked exactly like the confessionals from St. Louis Cathedral circa 1890. I'd received the letter that afternoon, slipped under my rectory door while I was visiting parishioners. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, written in fountain pen ink that seemed to shimmer between black and deep purple. Father Dubois, souls gather nightly at Sacred Heart Cemetery, but they require confession before they can rest. Please come at 3 a.m. if you have the courage to hear sins that are over a century old. New Orleans had taught me to take such communications seriously. In the city where voodoo and Catholicism had been dancing together for 3 centuries, where the line between the living and dead grew thin during hurricane season, where ancient curses lingered in the humid air like perfume, dismissing supernatural invitations was a luxury I couldn't afford. Sacred Heart Cemetery occupied 12 acres in the French Quarter's shadow, its above-ground tombs necessitated by a water table that lay just 3 feet below the surface. The cities of the dead, locals called these places, and standing among the marble monuments at 3 a.m., I understood why. The tombs rose like miniature cathedrals, their peaked roofs and ornate crosses creating a skyline of perpetual prayer. The fog rolled in from the Mississippi as I approached the confession booth, carrying scents of river mud and magnolia blossoms mixed with something else. Incense that had been burned in ceremonies I couldn't identify. The booth stood open, its priest door ajar in clear invitation. As I settled into the familiar confessional seat, muscle memory took over. I arranged my stole, positioned my prayer book, and waited for the first penitent to approach. The booth's interior felt authentic down to the smallest detail. Worn velvet kneelers, a small crucifix positioned where I could see it during difficult confessions, even the distinctive scent of old wood and countless whispered secrets. The first voice came from the penitent's side of the booth, separated from me by an ornate wooden screen that allowed only shadows and whispers to pass between us. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice was female, cultured, with the distinctive accent of antebellum New Orleans aristocracy. "It has been 137 years since my last confession." I gripped my prayer book tighter, reminding myself that in New Orleans, such statements weren't automatically impossible. "Please, tell me what weighs on your soul." "I murdered my husband," she said simply, her voice carrying no emotion despite the gravity of her words. "Not with poison or pistol, as the stories claim, but with something far more deliberate. I cursed him, Father. I sought out practitioners of arts that no Christian should acknowledge, and I bound his soul to suffer eternally." In through the screen, I could see her outline. A woman in an elaborate dress that rustled with each movement, a wide-brimmed hat adorned with feathers that moved despite the absence of wind. Her hands were folded in prayer, but her fingers were too long, extending beyond normal human proportions. "Why did you kill him?" I asked, falling back on the confessor's training to understand motivation before offering absolution. "He sold my daughter." Her voice broke slightly, the first crack in her composed demeanor. "Sold her to a plantation owner upriver, claimed she was my lady's maid rather than my child. He knew she was his daughter too, but her skin was too dark for his family's reputation. So he sold her like livestock and told society she'd been sent to school in Paris." The temperature around the confession booth plummeted as she spoke, and I could see frost forming on the wooden screen between us. Her grief and rage were so intense they altered the physical environment, turning the humid Louisiana night into something arctic. "I found practitioners who taught me to bind souls in torment," she continued. "Not just death. I wanted him to suffer as my daughter suffered. I wanted his spirit trapped between worlds, unable to rest, unable to reincarnate, unable to find peace until he acknowledged what he had done." "And did the curse work?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Too well," she whispered. "He died within a week, writhing in agony that no doctor could explain. But the curse, it didn't just bind him, it bound me as well. I cannot rest until he forgives me for what I did to him, and he cannot rest until he forgives himself for what he did to our daughter." As she spoke, more voices began joining hers from outside the confession booth. A man's voice, cultured but strained with centuries of anguish. "I feel the burning still, Celeste. Every night, the flames you bound to my soul consume me again." Through the booth's window, I could see them materializing in the cemetery's central avenue. Dozens of spectral figures, arranging themselves in a line that stretched between the tombs. They were waiting their turn for confession, souls who had been trapped by curses, vendetta, and spiritual bindings that had outlasted their physical lives. "The curse created a chain," Celeste explained, her elongated fingers pressing against the screen between us. "I cursed him for selling our daughter. He cursed me in return for destroying him. Others cursed us both for the scandal we brought to their families. And those others were cursed by their own enemies for different reasons entirely." Ooh. I began to understand the horrifying scope of what I was dealing with. New Orleans had always been a city where spiritual practices from multiple traditions intersected, where curses and blessings carried real power. These souls weren't just seeking forgiveness for their sins. They were trapped in webs of supernatural retribution that had grown more complex with each passing decade. "How many of you are bound together?" I asked. 47 souls, replied the man's voice from outside. "All connected by curses that feed on each other. We cannot rest until every grievance is confessed and forgiven, but new offenses keep adding to the chain." The line of waiting souls was becoming more visible as they spoke, their forms growing solid in response to my acknowledgement. of their presence. I could see the variety of their suffering. A woman whose skin showed the marks of burning despite her spectral state, a man whose throat bore the evidence of hanging, a child whose form flickered between life and death as if she couldn't decide which state to occupy. The curse chain has been growing for over a century, Celeste continued. Each soul that joins us brings their own unresolved spiritual bindings. We've become a collecting point for every hex, jinx, and spiritual vendetta in New Orleans history. I realized I was looking at the spiritual equivalent of a cancer, a network of supernatural grievances that had metastasized beyond any individual's ability to resolve. These souls weren't just seeking confession, they needed someone to break the chain that bound them all together. "What happens if I hear all your confessions?" I asked. "Can that break the bindings?" "We don't know," admitted the man outside. "No priest has been willing to try. The spiritual weight of 47 cursed souls. It might transfer to you. You might become the 48th link in our chain." The warning sent ice through my veins, but I also recognized the opportunity. These souls had been trapped for over a century, growing more numerous and desperate with each passing year. If the chain wasn't broken soon, it would continue expanding until it encompassed every spiritual grievance in the city. "I need to understand the mechanism," I said. "How do the curses connect to each other?" Celeste's outline became clearer as she leaned closer to the screen. "Pain seeks pain, Father. My curse on my husband created a wound in the spiritual fabric of this place. That wound attracted other souls with similar spiritual injuries. Each new soul we absorbed brought their own curses and conflicts, which then bonded to our existing network. The confession booth began to shake as the accumulated spiritual energy of 47 tortured souls pressed against its boundaries. The brass fixtures rattled, the wooden panels creaked, and the velvet curtains fluttered as if blown by hurricane winds that existed only in the supernatural realm. "The booth itself is part of the binding," Celeste said urgently. "It manifests each night because we need to confess, but confessing to each other only strengthens the chain. We need absolution from someone who isn't already bound to our network." I understood now why the confession booth had appeared. It was both trap and opportunity, a spiritual mechanism that could either bind me to their curse chain or provide the means to dissolve it entirely. The choice was mine, but either way, 47 souls were depending on my decision. Outside the booth, the waiting line of cursed souls pressed closer, their collective need creating a pressure that made my ears pop. Some of them began weeping, their tears forming pools of ectoplasm that glowed faintly in the darkness. Others prayed desperately in languages that predated English settlement of Louisiana. "Will you hear our confessions, Father?" Celeste asked. "Will you risk becoming bound to us in order to set us free?" I made my decision based on a fundamental principle of my faith. Sometimes shepherds must risk themselves to save the flock, even when the flock exists in realms beyond the living. "I'll hear every confession," I declared, "but we're going to do this properly, with genuine absolution, not just spiritual housekeeping." What followed was the longest night of my priestly career. One by one, 47 cursed souls entered the confession booth to share sins that had festered for decades or centuries. Each confession revealed new layers of the curse chain's complexity. Celeste had cursed her husband for selling their daughter, but her husband had sold the child because he was being blackmailed by his business partner, who was being extorted by a voodoo priestess who was seeking revenge against a priest who had refused her daughter last rites, who had been forbidden to serve black parishioners by his bishop, who was following policies designed to prevent mixing of spiritual traditions. Every soul in the chain was both victim and perpetrator, cursed by others while cursing in return. The spiritual bindings had created a self-perpetuating cycle of supernatural retribution that grew stronger with each new participant. As I offered absolution to each soul, I felt the weight of their collective curses attempting to transfer to me. The air around the confession booth grew thick as syrup, making each breath a struggle. Frost continued forming on every surface despite the humid Louisiana night, and with each ego te absolvo, I could feel spiritual chains wrapping around my own soul. But I also felt something else, the presence of divine grace working through the sacrament of confession. Each genuine absolution weakened the curse chains slightly, like cutting individual links from a massive spiritual anchor. "The chain is breaking," Celeste said with wonder as she prepared to leave the booth after her confession. "I can feel the binding loosening. But Father, you're taking on so much spiritual weight. How can you bear it?" I understood then what was happening. The curse chain couldn't simply be dissolved. Its spiritual energy had to go somewhere. By accepting the role of confessor to all 47 souls, I was temporarily taking on their collective spiritual burden. The question was whether I could survive the process long enough to complete all the confessions. By dawn, I had heard 46 confessions. Only one soul remained, a small child who had been caught in the curse chain through no fault of her own, simply because she had died while cursing the man who killed her mother. She approached the booth as the first rays of sunlight pierced the cemetery's canopy. "I don't have sins to confess," she said in a voice like silver bells. "I was only 7 when I died, but I'm bound to the others because I wished bad things on the man who hurt Mama." Her innocence was the key to breaking the entire chain. Unlike the other souls, she had no adult understanding of the spiritual forces she had invoked. Her curse was simply a child's wish for justice, free from the complex motivations that had bound the other souls. "You don't need absolution," I told her gently. "You need blessing. And your innocence can purify the entire chain if you're willing to forgive instead of curse." She considered this with the gravity that only children can bring to important decisions. "If I stop wishing bad things, will that help the other people?" "Yes," I said. "Your forgiveness can dissolve what their curses created." "Then I forgive everybody," she declared with simple finality. "Even the bad man. I just want to go see Mama now." The moment she spoke those words, the spiritual chains binding all 47 souls shattered like glass. The accumulated curse energy that had been transferring to me suddenly dissipated, released by the child's innocent forgiveness. One by one, the souls faded into peaceful light, finally free to continue their spiritual journey. But the experience left permanent marks on my soul. I can now see spiritual bindings that connect living people, the invisible chains of anger, resentment, and desire for revenge that bind us to each other in networks of mutual harm. I've become something of a specialist in breaking these connections through confession and forgiveness. The confession booth never appeared again, but I often return to that spot in Sacred Heart Cemetery. Sometimes I'll find small offerings left by grateful souls, flowers that never wilt, candles that burn without wax, prayers written in languages I don't recognize but somehow understand. The church doesn't officially acknowledge my work with curse breaking, but they don't discourage it either. Perhaps they understand that in cities like New Orleans, where spiritual traditions intersect in complex ways, priests must sometimes venture beyond conventional theology to serve souls that exist beyond conventional reality. Remember to subscribe. If these true stories are keeping you awake at night, we're only halfway through these 12 terrifying encounters. Now get ready. Let's start story 5. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The gravedigger had been dead for 3 weeks when I first saw him loading dirt into his phantom wheelbarrow. Harold Wickham, 73 years old, had suffered a massive heart attack while preparing a gravesite in the early morning hours. They found him slumped over his shovel, his weathered hands still gripping the handle, his face peaceful despite the circumstances. But apparently, death hadn't relieved Harold of his work duties. I'd come to Evergreen Cemetery to investigate reports from the new groundskeeping crew. 3 different men had quit in the past week, all claiming they were being supervised by a ghost who criticized their digging techniques and insisted on specific burial protocols that hadn't been used since the 1950s. "He's particular about the depth," explained Tom Morrison, the cemetery supervisor, as we walked among the headstones on that overcast October morning. "The new guys dig according to modern regulations, 6 feet deep, mechanically precise. But Harold, or whatever's left of Harold, he keeps telling them they're doing it wrong." Oregon's persistent drizzle misted around us as Tom led me to the section where Harold had worked for over 50 years. The old gravedigger had been something of a cemetery legend, a man who knew the burial history of every plot and maintained informal relationships with families whose loved ones he'd interred across 5 decades of service. "He started here when graves were still dug by hand," Tom continued. "Back when gravediggers were craftsmen, not machine operators. Harold knew which families preferred their dead facing east, which plots needed extra drainage, which graves required special accommodations for unusual coffin sizes. He carried all that information in his head. We reached the section where Harold had died, and I immediately felt the temperature difference. While the rest of the cemetery maintained the cool dampness typical of Pacific Northwest autumn, this area felt actively cold, as if winter had arrived early in this specific location. "There," Tom whispered, pointing toward a partially prepared gravesite. "Look at the pile of dirt!" I followed his gaze and saw something that made my breath catch. The excavated earth beside the grave was arranged in the precise, systematic way that experienced gravediggers used, layered by soil type, with clay separated from loam, with precise measurements that would allow for exact replacement after burial. But no living person was working the site. As we watched, a shovel moved by itself, adding dirt to the pile with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had performed the same task thousands of times. The shovel's blade bit into the earth with practiced efficiency, turning soil with an expertise that spoke of decades of experience. "Harold?" I called out tentatively. "Is that you?" The shovel paused mid-scoop, suspended in air for a moment before continuing its work. But now I could see the figure holding it, translucent but unmistakably Harold Wickham, wearing the same work clothes he'd died in, his weathered face set in the concentrated expression of a craftsman at work. "Father Thompson?" Harold's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like an echo in an empty church. "Good to see you. I've been trying to train these new boys, but they don't understand the proper way of things." I approached slowly, mindful that I was speaking with a soul who apparently didn't realize he was dead. "Harold, what are you working on?" "Mrs. Kowalski's grave," he replied matter-of-factly, gesturing toward the plot with his ghostly shovel. "She's being buried tomorrow, and that new fellow they hired dug it all wrong. Too deep, wrong orientation, no consideration for the drainage issues we've had in this section since 1987. He was right about the drainage. I could see standing water at the bottom of the grave that the modern crew had excavated, something Harold's experience would have predicted and prevented. "The new boys use machines for everything," Harold continued, his form becoming more solid as he spoke about his craft. "No feel for the soil, no understanding of how different earth types affect preservation. Mrs. Kowalski's family has been burying here for 4 generations. They expect their dead treated with the same care I gave their grandparents." I realized I was witnessing something unique, a soul so dedicated to his craft that death hadn't severed his connection to his work. Harold wasn't haunting the cemetery out of unfinished business or spiritual trauma. He was simply continuing to do what he'd always done, caring for the dead with the expertise that had defined his life. "Harold," I said gently, "do you know what happened to you?" He paused in his digging, leaning on the shovel handle in a gesture I'd seen him make countless times during his living years. "Had the heart attack, didn't I? Bad one. But there's work to be done, Father. The dead deserve proper graves, and these new fellows, they mean well, but they don't know the old ways. As Harold continued working, more ghostly figures began appearing throughout the cemetery. These weren't random spirits, but former employees who had worked alongside Harold over the decades. Gravediggers, groundskeepers, even a few funeral directors who had collaborated with him on difficult burials. "That's Eddie Martinez," Harold said, nodding toward a translucent figure operating a phantom lawnmower near the veterans section. "Worked here 22 years before the cancer got him. He's particular about keeping the military graves neat, says it's disrespectful to let weeds grow on a soldier's plot." Another figure appeared near the maintenance shed, a woman in coveralls from the 1970s who was organizing tools that existed only in spectral form. "Sarah Chen," Harold explained, "first woman groundskeeper we ever hired, died in '89, but she still checks the equipment every morning. Good worker, that one." I began to understand that I wasn't dealing with a single haunting, but with an entire ghostly workforce that had been maintaining Evergreen Cemetery according to standards that the living staff couldn't perceive. These spirits weren't malevolent or trapped. They were simply continuing their work from beyond the grave. "But Harold," I said, trying to understand the mechanism of what I was witnessing, "why are you all still here? Don't you want to rest?" Harold paused in his digging, his weathered face showing genuine confusion. "Rest? Father, this is my rest. This is what I know how to do. You spend 50 years learning every inch of a place, every family story, every special request. That knowledge doesn't just disappear because your heart stops beating." The temperature continued dropping as more spectral workers appeared. I could see my breath misting in the air, and frost began forming on the metal cemetery equipment despite the mild October weather. The collective presence of so many dedicated souls was affecting the physical environment. "We've been trying to train the new crew," explained Sarah Chen, approaching with her ghostly clipboard in hand. "But they can't see us, can't hear our instructions. They're making mistakes that would have horrified Harold when he was alive." I watched as the living groundskeeping crew arrived for their morning shift, completely unaware of the spectral supervisors surrounding them. The contrast was stark. The modern workers operated with mechanical efficiency but little personal connection to their work, while the ghost crew moved with the careful attention of artisans. "They use GPS to locate graves now," Harold said with disapproval, watching a young groundskeeper consult his tablet. "No understanding of the family histories, no sense of the relationships between different plots. Mrs. Henderson's grave is right next to her sister's, but they don't know the sisters requested to be buried holding hands. They're digging too far apart." I realized the ghostly workers were becoming increasingly frustrated with the changes in cemetery management. Modern efficiency had replaced the personal touch that had characterized Harold's era, and the spirits were unable to communicate their accumulated wisdom to the living staff. "The families notice," Sarah added sadly. "They come to visit their loved ones and see that things aren't maintained the way they used to be. They ask questions about burial protocols that the new staff can't answer because they don't know the history." But something else was happening. As the ghost crew became more agitated about the declining standards, their spectral energy was beginning to affect the cemetery's equipment. Lawnmowers sputtered and died when operated incorrectly. Shovels broke when used with poor technique. Even the computer systems in the main office had been malfunctioning, displaying burial records for people who weren't scheduled for interment. "We're not trying to cause problems," Harold insisted, but I could see that his emotional state was affecting his manifestation. His form flickered between solid and translucent, and the temperature around him fluctuated wildly. "We just want things done right." The situation was becoming untenable. The ghostly workers were inadvertently sabotaging the living staff's efforts, creating a cycle where poor performance led to more spectral interference, which led to even worse performance. The cemetery was caught between two competing standards of care, with the dead refusing to accept the shortcuts that the living considered acceptable. "Harold," I said, recognizing the need to address the core issue, "what would it take for you to feel comfortable moving on? What would convince you that the cemetery is in good hands?" He stopped digging and looked at me with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting his craft. "Training, Father, real training. These new workers need to understand that they're not just digging holes and cutting grass. They're caring for people's most precious memories. Every grave tells a story, and those stories deserve respect. I propose something unprecedented, a training program where the living staff would learn directly from the ghostly workers." It took weeks of careful negotiation with both the cemetery administration and the spirits themselves. But eventually, we established a system where Harold and his spectral crew could pass on their knowledge. The process required me to serve as translator and intermediary. During early morning hours, when the mist made the spirit world more accessible, I would bring the living groundskeepers to specific sections of the cemetery where Harold and his crew would demonstrate proper techniques. "See how Harold positions the shovel?" I explained to Jake, the newest groundskeeper, as we watched the ghostly figure work. "He's testing the soil density with each cut, adjusting his angle to account for underground obstacles that your equipment can't detect." Jake couldn't see Harold directly, but he could observe the results. Dirt that fell in precise patterns, excavations that revealed optimal drainage solutions, repairs to older graves that address problems the modern crew hadn't even noticed. "The old-timer knew what he was doing," Jake admitted, after watching an invisible force correct his lawn mowing pattern around a delicate memorial statue. "I've been treating this like landscaping, but it's more like archaeology. Every plot has specific requirements." Over several weeks, the spectral training program yielded remarkable results. The living groundskeepers began incorporating techniques that Harold's generation had developed through decades of experience. They learned to read soil conditions, to understand family preferences, to maintain graves with the personal attention that had once been standard. But more importantly, the living staff began to understand that cemetery work was a form of ministry, a way of serving families during their most vulnerable moments and honoring the dead through careful stewardship of their resting places. "It's not just about cutting grass and digging graves," explained Maria Santos, who had become Harold's most dedicated student. "It's about maintaining a sacred space where grief can transform into peace. Harold taught me that every detail matters because people notice everything when they're mourning." As the living staff improved their skills and developed genuine reverence for their work, Harold and his spectral crew gradually began to fade. Their mission was being accomplished. The knowledge they'd accumulated over decades was being passed to a new generation of caretakers. "You did good, Father," Harold told me during our final conversation, his form now barely visible in the early morning mist. "These young folks understand now. They know that we're not just maintaining a cemetery, we're protecting people's last connection to their loved ones." One by one, the ghostly workers completed their spectral shifts and moved on to whatever comes after. Sarah Chen was the last to go, pausing to make one final inspection of the equipment shed before fading into peaceful light. But Harold's influence didn't end with his departure. The training program I developed became a model for other cemeteries struggling with similar issues. Cemetery administration began hiring workers who understood that their job required both technical skill and emotional intelligence. More importantly, I learned that some souls remain earthbound, not because they're trapped by trauma or unfinished business, but because they have knowledge that needs to be preserved. Harold and his crew weren't haunting Evergreen Cemetery. They were protecting institutional memory that would have been lost forever without their ghostly intervention. The experience changed how I understand the relationship between the living and the dead. We often think of death as a final separation, but some connections transcend mortality. The dedication that Harold felt to his craft was so profound that it created a bridge between worlds, allowing wisdom to flow from past to present. Since then, I've served as an intermediary in similar situations at other cemeteries, hospitals and churches where institutional knowledge was being lost due to staff turnover or modernization. I've learned to recognize the signs of beneficial hauntings, spiritual presences that seek to preserve rather than disturb, to teach rather than terrorize. The groundskeeping crew at Evergreen Cemetery still reports occasional supernatural assistance during difficult projects. A shovel that seems to guide itself toward optimal digging angles, lawn mowers that run smoothly when operated with proper respect, computer systems that automatically correct errors in burial records. But these incidents feel different now, not like hauntings, but like blessings. Harold and his crew established a tradition of excellence that continues to influence the cemetery's operations, creating a standard of care that honors both the dead and the living who serve them. Sometimes the greatest gift the dead can offer isn't peace or forgiveness, but the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of dedicated service. Harold Wickham taught me that some work is so important, it transcends death itself. Now get ready, let's start story 5, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The bride appeared at exactly 11:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before her wedding would have begun 93 years ago. She materialized beside the ornate mausoleum where her body had been interred after the yellow fever epidemic of 1930. Her spectral form dressed in a beaded gown that caught moonlight like captured starfire. I'd come to Rosewood Cemetery to investigate what the staff diplomatically called recurring evening celebrations. For 3 months, visitors and groundskeepers had reported the sounds of jazz music, laughter, and champagne glasses clinking near the Beauregard family mausoleum. Security cameras captured nothing, but multiple witnesses described seeing elegantly dressed figures dancing among the headstones as if attending the most joyous party in Charleston's history. The phenomenon had started on the anniversary of what locals called the tragedy, June 15th, when Catherine Beauregard and her entire wedding party had succumbed to yellow fever just hours before their planned midnight ceremony. 23 souls, including the bride, groom, and their closest friends, had died within a week of each other, victims of an epidemic that swept through Charleston's elite social circles like divine retribution for their excesses. Standing among the moss-draped monuments of South Carolina's most prestigious cemetery, I could feel the weight of history pressing against the humid night air. Rosewood had been designed to mirror Père Lachaise in Paris, with elaborate tombs and winding paths that transformed death into theater. If any place could sustain ghostly celebrations, it would be here. The music started softly, a brass ensemble playing Ain't She Sweet, with the syncopated rhythm that had made jazz-age Charleston famous worldwide. The melody seemed to emerge from the earth itself, rising through marble foundations and iron gates until the entire cemetery hummed with spectral rhythm. Then I saw them materializing like memories given form. A jazz band arranged beside a towering oak tree, their instruments gleaming with otherworldly polish. The musicians wore formal evening wear from the 1920s, their faces animated with the joy of performers who had found their eternal audience. "You're just in time for the ceremony," called a voice from behind me. I turned to see a young man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back in the style of the era. Despite his translucent state, he radiated the confidence of someone accustomed to hosting elaborate social events. "I'm Marcus Beauregard," he continued with a courtly bow. "Catherine's intended, though we never quite made it to the altar. We've been waiting for a priest to complete our vows, and tonight feels auspicious." The bride approached from her family's mausoleum, moving with the grace of someone who had spent her life at cotillions and charity galas. Catherine Beauregard was breathtakingly beautiful, even in death. Her blonde hair arranged in finger waves that framed a face that belonged in museum portraits of Southern aristocracy. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the melodic accent of Charleston society. "We've been practicing for months, learning to manifest together, to maintain our forms long enough for a proper ceremony. We know we're dead, but love doesn't end just because the heart stops beating." Around us, more spectral figures materialized, bridesmaids in pastel gowns that floated like silk clouds, groomsmen adjusting bow ties that existed only in spiritual memory, elderly relatives who had crossed over to attend the wedding they'd missed in life. The entire Beauregard social circle was assembling for a celebration that death had delayed but not cancelled. "We understand if this seems irregular," Marcus said, gesturing toward the gathering crowd of well-dressed spirits. "But we've consulted with authorities in our current realm, and they've confirmed that souls can indeed be united in marriage if both parties consent and a proper ceremony is performed." I found myself in uncharted theological territory. My seminary training had never addressed the possibility of marrying the dead, but these souls weren't asking for something macabre or unholy. They were seeking the spiritual union that disease had prevented, the sacramental completion of a love that had transcended mortality. "Have you considered," I asked carefully, "that marriage is traditionally understood as a bond for this earthly life? Until death do us part, as the liturgy states?" Catherine laughed, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. "Father, we've been apart for 93 years. If death was meant to separate us permanently, wouldn't we have moved on by now? Instead, we've grown closer, learning to love each other's souls without the distractions of physical existence." The jazz band began playing All of Me, and couples throughout the gathering started dancing with fluid grace that defied the laws of physics. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they'd been practicing together for decades in some spectral ballroom. As the ghostly wedding party continued their preparations, I began to notice disturbing details that contradicted the romantic narrative they'd presented. The bridesmaids' pastel gowns showed subtle stains that looked suspiciously like blood. The groomsmen's cheerful expressions flickered occasionally, revealing faces twisted by pain and fever. And the jazz music, while beautifully performed, carried undertones of discord that made my teeth ache. "Tell me about your deaths," I said to Catherine, needing to understand the true nature of what I was witnessing. "Yellow fever is a painful way to die. Are you certain you've processed that trauma?" Her perfect composure cracked slightly, revealing something desperate beneath her aristocratic poise. "We prefer not to dwell on unpleasant memories, Father. Tonight is about celebration, about finally completing what was interrupted." But Marcus's form was becoming less stable, flickering between his handsome evening wear and something far. But Marcus's form was becoming less stable, flickering between his handsome evening wear and something far more disturbing. For brief moments, I could see him as he had died, skin yellowed by jaundice, body contorted by the hemorrhagic fever that had destroyed his internal organs, eyes reflecting the terror of someone who had suffered enormously before death provided release. "The fever dreams," he whispered, his voice momentarily losing its confident tone. "They never really stopped, even here, even now. We sometimes slip back into the delirium. The music helps us remember who we were before the sickness took us." I realized that this wasn't a simple case of souls seeking delayed happiness. These spirits were trapped in a cycle of reliving their final moments, using the fantasy of a perfect wedding to avoid confronting the trauma of their deaths. The elaborate celebration was a form of spiritual denial, a way of avoiding the healing that could only come through accepting their suffering. "Catherine," I said gently, "show me how you really died." Her beautiful facade shattered like a broken mirror. Suddenly I could see her as she had been in her final hours, a young woman burning with fever, her body racked by convulsions, vomiting blood while calling desperately for her fiancé who lay dying in the next room. The elegant wedding gown dissolved, revealing a nightdress soaked in sweat and bodily fluids. "No," she sobbed, her voice now carrying the pain she'd been suppressing for 93 years. "We don't talk about that part. We only remember the good times, the love, the plans we made, the wedding that should have been." The other spirits began losing their festive appearances as well. The bridesmaids showed the ravages of disease, skin discolored by internal bleeding, hair falling out in patches, bodies distorted by the swelling that accompanied yellow fever's final stages. The jazz band's instruments cracked and tarnished, their music becoming a cacophony of discordant notes that reflected spiritual anguish rather than celebration. "We've been running from the truth," Marcus admitted, his tuxedo now stained with the evidence of his death. "Every night, for 93 years, we've gathered to play at being happy, to pretend that love conquered all. But we never actually processed what happened to us. We never grieved properly. The temperature around us plummeted as the spirit's suppressed trauma began manifesting physically. The elegant party decorations, flowers, ribbons, champagne glasses began rotting at an accelerated pace, transforming from wedding beauty into funeral decay. The dancing couples stumbled and fell, their graceful movements deteriorating into the convulsions they'd experienced while dying. "We can't maintain the illusion anymore," Catherine cried, reaching for Marcus with hands that were now transparent and flickering. "Father, we thought if we could just have our perfect wedding, we could escape the memory of how we died. But the fever dreams keep breaking through." I understood now that I was witnessing mass spiritual trauma. 23 souls who had died in agony, clinging to each other through shared denial rather than healing together through shared grief. Their love was real, but it had become corrupted by their refusal to accept the full reality of their experience. "You're trying to have a wedding without acknowledging that you've already had a funeral," I told them. "Love doesn't mean forgetting pain. It means supporting each other through it." The ghostly gathering began to destabilize further as my words forced them to confront their avoidance. Some spirits flickered out entirely, unable to maintain manifestation while processing their suppressed trauma. Others doubled over in spectral agony, finally allowing themselves to experience the grief they'd been avoiding for nearly a century. "What if we have a different kind of ceremony?" I proposed, watching the wedding party dissolve into spiritual chaos. "Not a wedding that pretends death didn't happen, but a service that honors both your love and your suffering." Catherine and Marcus looked at me with desperate hope, still reaching for each other across the spiritual void that their trauma had created. "What do you mean?" Catherine asked, her voice barely audible over the sounds of spectral weeping. "A memorial service that celebrates your love while acknowledging your loss," I explained. "A ceremony that allows you to grieve together instead of running from grief separately. You can't build a marriage on denial, but you can build healing on shared truth." What followed was unlike any service I'd ever conducted. Instead of traditional wedding vows, Catherine and Marcus spoke honestly about their deaths, describing the fear and pain they'd experienced while affirming their continued love for each other. The other spirits joined them, each soul sharing their individual experience of dying while receiving comfort from the community of those who had suffered similarly. "I was terrified," Marcus admitted, his form stabilizing as he spoke truth instead of fantasy. "I wanted to be brave for Catherine, but the fever made me delirious. I said things I didn't mean, did things I'm ashamed of. I died afraid and alone, even though she was in the next room." Catherine nodded, tears flowing freely down her spectral cheeks. "I blamed God for taking our future away. I died angry, not at peace. For 93 years, I've been trying to rewrite that ending, to make our story beautiful instead of tragic." As each spirit shared their authentic experience, something remarkable happened. Their forms began to solidify, not into the idealized wedding party they'd been playing, but into their true selves. Souls who had loved deeply and suffered greatly, who carried both beauty and trauma in equal measure. "Love doesn't erase pain," I said. speaking the words that would serve as their true vows. But love can transform pain into something meaningful. Your deaths were tragic, but your love story doesn't end with tragedy if you choose to heal together. Instead of exchanging rings, Catherine and Marcus exchanged memories, not just the happy courtship moments they'd been replaying, but the full spectrum of their relationship, including the fear and helplessness they'd felt while dying. The other spirits paired off similarly, some as couples, others as friends and family members, all choosing to face their shared trauma together rather than escaping from it individually. Do you, Catherine and Marcus, and all you gathered souls, choose to support each other through the complete truth of your experience? I asked, improvising liturgy for a situation no seminary had prepared me for. Do you commit to healing together, to grieving together, and to finding peace together? We do, they replied in unison, their voices carrying the strength that comes from accepting reality rather than fighting it. The change was immediate and profound. The cemetery's oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by something that felt like dawn breaking after a long night. The spirits didn't disappear, but their desperate clinging to earthly manifestation relaxed. They were finally free to exist as souls, rather than as prisoners of their own denial. Catherine and Marcus faded hand in hand, but their departure felt like completion rather than loss. The other spirits followed, each one pausing to thank me for helping them find the courage to face their truth. But the experience left me profoundly changed. I realized that many living people use the same strategies that had trapped these souls, avoiding painful realities through elaborate fantasies, pretending that love means never having to face difficult truths together. Since that night, I've counseled numerous couples who were unconsciously trying to have relationships based on idealized versions of themselves rather than authentic engagement with their complete humanity. The dead had taught me that genuine intimacy requires the courage to be vulnerable about our pain, not just our joy. The Beauregard family mausoleum stands quiet now, no longer disturbed by ghostly celebrations. But sometimes, on the anniversary of that strange ceremony, visitors report catching glimpses of spectral figures who radiate peace rather than desperation. Souls who learned that love grows stronger when it encompasses the full truth of our experience. The wedding party finally found their happily ever after, not by avoiding death, but by choosing to heal from it together. Sometimes the most beautiful ceremony isn't the one that celebrates perfection, but the one that sanctifies the courage to be authentically broken and genuinely whole at the same time. These stories are getting under your skin, aren't they? That cold feeling creeping up your spine, the way you keep glancing over your shoulder. That's exactly how I felt during each of these encounters. If you're brave enough to hear the remaining 6 stories, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, what's coming next will make these first 6 seem like bedtime stories. We're about to enter the darkest territory yet, encounters that change not just my understanding of death, but my faith in the boundaries between worlds. Now get ready, let's start story 7. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The hymn was Amazing Grace, but they were singing it backwards, each verse reversing the message of salvation until the beautiful melody became a prayer for damnation. I stood at the gates of St. Agnes Cemetery at 2:33 a.m., listening to voices that should have been praising God, instead begging to be forsaken by Him. Detroit's abandoned neighborhoods had taught me that some places hold on to their pain long after their people are gone. But St. Agnes Cemetery existed in a category of spiritual desolation I'd never encountered. The grounds had been neglected for 15 years, ever since the Archdiocese declared bankruptcy and transferred maintenance responsibilities to a secular company that viewed cemetery care as minimum wage landscaping rather than sacred stewardship. They started singing about 3 weeks ago, explained Detective Maria Santos, who had called me after multiple noise complaints from the few remaining residents in the surrounding blocks. Always the same time, always the same songs, but wrong somehow, like they're remembering hymns from a church service in hell. The neighborhood around St. Agnes had been hollowed out by economic collapse, leaving behind empty lots where houses once stood and broken streetlights that cast everything in pools of sickly yellow illumination. The cemetery itself sat like an island of additional despair, its iron gates rusted shut, its headstones toppled by vandals and indifference. But something was stirring in that neglected ground. As I approached the fence line, I could hear them clearly now, dozens of voices harmonizing with supernatural precision, their collective sound carrying across the abandoned blocks like a spiritual siren song that called to anyone desperate enough to listen. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. But the words were wrong, twisted. Amazing grace, how bitter the sound that forsook a soul like me. I once was found, but now am lost. Was blessed, but now can't see. I climbed the fence despite Detective Santos's protests, compelled by priestly duty to investigate what sounded like souls in active spiritual distress. The moment my feet touched the cemetery ground, the temperature plummeted and the singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being submerged in spiritual cotton. Then I saw them emerging from behind weathered monuments, figures in tattered choir robes that might once have been white, but now appeared stained with substances I didn't want to identify. They arranged themselves in traditional choir formation, with sopranos and altos in front, tenors and basses behind, but their faces showed the hollow desperation of souls who had given up hope entirely. "Father," called the choir director, a tall figure whose features seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. "How wonderful that you've come to join our evening praise service. We've been practicing these hymns for quite some time now." The choir members turned toward me in perfect unison, their movements synchronized in a way that living performers never achieved. But their eyes were wrong. Not evil exactly, but filled with a resignation so profound it made my chest ache to look at them directly. "We were the choir of St. Agnes Church," explained a woman in the soprano section, her voice carrying the trained quality of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. "For 47 years, we sang God's praises every Sunday, every holiday, every funeral and wedding. We believed our voices carried prayers directly to heaven." "Then the church closed," added a bass singer, his voice resonating with bitterness that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Budget cuts," they said. "Declining attendance. The archdiocese sold our building to developers who turned it into luxury condominiums for people who would never have set foot in our sanctuary." I began to understand the source of their spiritual corruption. These souls had dedicated their earthly lives to worship, only to watch their sacred space be converted into secular profit. Their faith had been so intertwined with their physical church that when the building was deconsecrated, they felt abandoned by God himself. "We died one by one over the years," continued the choir director. "Heart attacks during practice, strokes after seeing our church demolished, cancer that ate through our bodies like the despair ate through our souls. But death didn't stop our voices, Father. If anything, it amplified them." The choir began humming softly, their voices creating harmonies that were technically perfect, but spiritually hollow. The sound was beautiful and terrible simultaneously, like hearing angels sing while falling from grace. "We gather here every night to practice our revised repertoire," the soprano explained. "Songs that reflect our new understanding. If God could abandon his faithful servants so easily, perhaps we were worshipping the wrong deity all along." The choir's humming grew louder, and I realized they weren't just singing backwards hymns. They were actively inverting the spiritual energy of sacred music, transforming prayers into curses, praise into blasphemy. Each note carried a weight that pressed against my soul like spiritual gravity, trying to drag me down to their level of despair. "Listen to our new arrangement of How Great Thou Art," the choir director said with pride, that chilled me more than their obvious corruption. We've adapted it to better reflect our current theological understanding. They began singing in perfect four-part harmony. O Lord my God, how small thou art! When I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have wrought, I see you torn asunder. When through the woods and forest glades I wander, I hear no birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, I hear the groaning of a world that grieves. The reversed theology was more disturbing than outright satanic chanting because it maintained the emotional framework of worship while completely inverting its meaning. These souls weren't rebelling against God. They were worshipping a version of divinity that had betrayed and abandoned them. As they sang, the cemetery around us began to respond to their spiritual energy. Dead flowers on neglected graves bloomed into grotesque parodies of life. Roses that were black as midnight, lilies that dripped with substances that looked like tears. The toppled headstones began writing themselves, but their inscriptions changed as they moved, transforming messages of hope and resurrection into epitaphs of abandonment and despair. We've been recruiting new members, explained the alto section leader, gesturing toward the far end of the cemetery where more figures were materializing. Other souls who died feeling forsaken by faith, abandoned by the institutions they'd served faithfully. They're drawn to our music like moths to flame. I could see them now. Dozens of additional spirits emerging from graves throughout St. Agnes Cemetery. Former priests whose churches had been closed, nuns whose convents had been sold, lay ministers whose life's work had been dismissed as financially unsustainable. All of them carried the same expression of profound spiritual betrayal. Father Morrison, I recognized one of the approaching figures, a priest who had served Detroit's inner city for 30 years before dying of exhaustion and heartbreak when his parish was consolidated into a suburban megachurch. I heard you protested the closure of St. Timothy's. Good for you, but it didn't matter, did it? They closed us anyway. The choir's music was becoming more complex, with the additional voices adding harmonies that seemed to bend reality around them. Streetlights began flickering in rhythm with their songs. Windows in the few remaining neighborhood houses cracked as spiritual pressure built to unbearable levels. We're composing our masterwork, the choir director announced, with the fervor of someone who had found new purpose in destruction. A complete inversion of the Mass set to traditional melodies, but with lyrics that reflect the truth of divine abandonment. When we perform it, we'll demonstrate to any listening souls that faithful service means nothing to a God who values profit over prayer. I realized they were planning something far more dangerous than nightly concerts of perverted hymns. They intended to create a spiritual anti-mass that would corrupt the faith of any soul who heard it, spreading their despair and abandonment like a supernatural virus through Detroit's already devastated spiritual landscape. You're not abandoned, I said, trying to reach whatever remained of their original faith. The church buildings may be gone, but God hasn't left you. Your anger is understandable, but you're letting it poison the very gift you were given. Your voices, your ability to praise. The choir director laughed, a sound like cathedral bells being shattered with sledgehammers. Praise? We praised for decades, Father. We sang our hearts out every Sunday, believing our voices carried directly to the throne of heaven. Then we watched everything we'd served be sold to the highest bidder. If that's how God treats his faithful servants, perhaps our voices belong elsewhere now. The temperature continued dropping as more corrupted souls joined their ranks. I could see my breath misting in the air, and frost began forming on the few remaining flowers that hadn't been twisted by their spiritual presence. Sing with us, Father, urged the soprano who had first spoken to me. You've seen how the church treats its servants. You know that faithfulness is rewarded with abandonment. Let your voice join ours in honest acknowledgement of divine betrayal. I understood then that I wasn't just witnessing spiritual corruption. I was being recruited to join it. These souls had found a way to process their abandonment that felt emotionally satisfying while being spiritually destructive. They wanted me to validate their pain by sharing in their blasphemy. "Your anger is justified," I said, surprising them with my agreement. "The institutional church failed you terribly. But you're conflating the church with God, and they're not the same thing." The choir's perfect harmony faltered slightly as they processed my words. I pressed my advantage, speaking to the hurt beneath their corruption. "You sang Amazing Grace because you experienced grace as amazing. You praised God because you felt His presence in your music. Those experiences were real, even if the institution that facilitated them was flawed." "But they took everything from us," protested Father Morrison, his spectral form flickering between the devoted priest he'd been and the bitter soul he'd become. "Our churches, our communities, our life's work, all sold off like inventory." "They took the buildings," I acknowledged. "They took the institutional support. But did they take your ability to sing? Did they take the experiences of transcendence you felt when your voices lifted together in praise?" For the first time since I'd arrived, the choir fell completely silent. I could see them struggling with the distinction I was drawing between their authentic spiritual experiences and the institutional framework that had supported them. "I propose a different kind of concert," I said. "Not the inverted mass you're planning, but a memorial service for your churches, for your communities, for the version of institutional Christianity that supported your ministries. Let yourselves grieve what was lost without corrupting what remains." The choir director's features solidified into something more recognizably human. "A memorial service for buildings, for dreams," I corrected, "for the vision of church community that sustained you for decades, for the version of Christianity that valued beautiful worship over efficient profit margins. Those things deserve to be mourned properly, not perverted into weapons of spiritual destruction." What followed was unlike anything in my liturgical experience. The corrupted choir became a congregation in grief, singing traditional hymns not as praise or blasphemy, but as lament for what had been lost. Their voices carried authentic sorrow instead of manufactured bitterness, processing their abandonment as grief rather than rage. "Holy, holy, holy," they sang. But this time the melody carried the weight of souls saying goodbye to a version of holiness they'd never experience again. The twisted flowers returned to their natural state of decay, and the rearranged headstones settled back into their original positions. But now the atmosphere felt like a proper funeral rather than a spiritual inversion. "We love those churches," whispered the soprano, tears flowing down her spectral cheeks. "We loved the smell of incense, the way sunlight looked through stained glass, the feeling of community when our voices joined together. We loved it so much that losing it felt like losing God Himself. But God wasn't contained in those buildings," I said gently. "God was present in your love for those buildings, in your dedication to worship, in your voices lifting together. That presence doesn't disappear when the institutional framework changes." One by one, the choir members began to fade, but this time their departure felt like release rather than abandonment. They had finally grieved properly for what they'd lost, which freed them to recognize what remained. Father Morrison was among the last to go. "Thank you for helping us remember the difference between loving God and loving the church," he said. "We'd forgotten that losing the institution doesn't mean losing the relationship." As dawn broke over Detroit's abandoned landscape, I stood alone in St. Agnes Cemetery. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by the peaceful quiet that should characterize consecrated ground. But the experience had taught me something crucial about the relationship between faith and institution. Many of my living parishioners struggled with similar feelings of abandonment as parishes closed and merged, as traditional forms of worship gave way to contemporary efficiency. I began incorporating grief rituals into my ministry, helping people mourn institutional losses without losing their faith in the divine reality those institutions had supported. The choir's perverted concerts never resumed, but sometimes During particularly moving liturgies, I'll hear additional voices joining our congregational singing, spirits who learned that authentic worship transcends any particular building or institutional structure. They remind me that faith is ultimately about relationship, not real estate. Now get ready, let's start story 8. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The flowers grew backward through time, their petals unfurling in reverse chronological order until they revealed the faces of the dead planted beneath them. I'd come to investigate reports of botanical anomalies in Woodlawn Cemetery's historic section, but standing among roses that bloomed with human features and lilies that whispered names in languages I couldn't identify, I realized I was witnessing something far beyond natural science. San Francisco's fog had rolled in thick that October evening, transforming the cemetery into a landscape of shifting shadows and muffled sounds. Woodlawn had served the city's diverse population for over 150 years, its grounds holding immigrants from every corner of the world who had died far from their ancestral homes. But this particular section, known locally as the Plague Garden, had been sealed off since 1918 after the last bodies from the Spanish flu epidemic were interred here. "It started 3 weeks ago," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the city botanist who had contacted me after exhausting scientific explanations for what she was observing. The plants began growing in patterns that don't exist in nature, flowers blooming in mathematical sequences, vines arranging themselves into symbols that predate written language, trees bearing fruit that shows scenes from the past when you bite into them. The cemetery's maintenance crew had fled after several workers reported flowers that bled when cut and grass that grew into words spelled out in scripts from dead civilizations. The city had quietly cordoned off the area, while officials debated whether they were dealing with environmental contamination or something requiring entirely different expertise. As we walked deeper into the Plague Garden, the fog seemed to thicken around us with deliberate intent, creating pockets of visibility that revealed increasingly disturbing botanical arrangements. Roses grew in perfect spirals that hurt to look at directly, their thorns arranged in patterns that seemed to spell out messages in Morse code. Daisies bloomed with centers that showed tiny moving pictures of historical events, like organic television screens broadcasting from the past. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez whispered, kneeling beside a patch of violets that grew in the exact shape of a human hand. "The cellular structure is normal, but they're arranging themselves according to some kind of external intelligence. And when I run genetic tests, I keep finding DNA sequences that match the people buried beneath them." I understood why she'd called a priest instead of continuing with purely scientific investigation. The plants weren't just growing unusually. They were channeling the memories and personalities of the souls interred in this ground, becoming living memorials that displayed the inner lives of the dead. The first voice reached me as we approached the central monument, a marble obelisk erected to commemorate the Spanish flu victims. It was barely audible at first, like wind through leaves, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it was singing, a lullaby in Mandarin Chinese, carried on the scent of jasmine flowers that shouldn't bloom in October. "Who's there?" I called out gently, using the tone I'd learned for speaking with patients in hospital gardens where the line between life and death grew thin. A small voice responded from somewhere near my feet. "I'm Li Wei. I was 7 when the sickness took me. I grew these flowers so Mama could find me when she comes looking. Looking down, I saw a cluster of chrysanthemums arranged in the shape of a child's drawing, simple flowers with smiling faces, the kind a 7-year-old might create to comfort herself during illness. The petals moved slightly as Li Wei spoke, creating facial expressions that matched her words. She died too," Li Wei continued sadly. "The sickness took our whole family. But I keep growing flowers for her anyway, because she promised she would always find me, no matter what." More voices began joining hers, each one emerging from different plant arrangements throughout the garden. An elderly Italian man spoke through a grapevine that bore fruit in impossible seasons, telling stories of the vineyard he'd left behind in Tuscany. A young Irish woman manifested through shamrocks that grew in intricate Celtic knots, singing ballads about the homeland she'd never seen again. "We all died far from home," explained a voice that seemed to come from an entire flower bed of mixed wildflowers. Immigrants who came to America seeking better lives, only to die in a plague that didn't care about our dreams or our homesickness. So we grow gardens that remind us of the places we left behind. I realized I was witnessing a form of spiritual botany, souls who had died displaced and homesick, using their connection to the earth to create living memorials to the cultures and landscapes they'd been forced to abandon. Each plant arrangement told a story of migration, loss, and the fundamental human need to put down roots, even in death. As more souls began manifesting through their botanical extensions, I started to understand the dangerous complexity of what was happening in the plague garden. These weren't simple spirits seeking comfort. They were displaced souls attempting to recreate their homeland environments through supernatural manipulation of plant life, and their efforts were beginning to affect the natural ecosystem of the entire cemetery. "The problem is spreading, Doctor," Martinez explained, showing me photographs taken from the cemetery's perimeter. "Plants throughout Woodlawn are beginning to show similar anomalies. Native California species are being replaced by flora from every continent, as if the souls are terraforming the cemetery to match their collective memories of home." The evidence was undeniable. A section that should have contained nothing but native oak trees now sprouted baobabs from Africa, cherry blossoms from Japan, and olive groves from the Mediterranean. The soil itself was changing composition, transforming to accommodate plant species that had no business surviving in San Francisco's climate. "We're homesick," admitted Chen Lu, whose voice emerged from a stand of bamboo that swayed despite the absence of wind. "We died in a foreign land, speaking a foreign language, buried according to foreign customs. Death was supposed to take us home, but instead we remained here, more displaced than ever." The spiritual logic was heartbreaking but ecologically catastrophic. These souls were collectively remaking their burial ground to resemble every corner of the world they'd come from, creating a supernatural ecosystem that threatened to spread beyond the cemetery's boundaries into San Francisco's carefully balanced urban environment. "The city's native plants are dying," Dr. Martinez continued, her scientific training warring with the evidence before her eyes. "Whatever energy these souls are using to manifest their homeland flora, it's draining the life force from indigenous species. We're looking at potential ecological collapse if this continues." But the situation was more complex than simple botanical invasion. As I moved deeper into the plague garden, I began to notice that the foreign plants weren't thriving. They were struggling to survive in soil and climate conditions that couldn't sustain them. The soul's homesickness was creating elaborate displays of vegetation that were beautiful but fundamentally unstable. "The flowers keep dying." Li Wei's voice carried new sadness as her chrysanthemums began wilting even as she spoke through them. "I try to grow the ones Mama loved in China, but they don't understand this American earth. They bloom for a few days, then turn brown and fall apart." I watched as entire sections of the garden went through accelerated cycles of growth and decay, souls pouring their spiritual energy into recreating homeland plants that couldn't survive in their adopted environment. Their effort was creating a feedback loop of frustration and increasing desperation that manifested as more aggressive botanical manipulation. "We're consuming the life force of everything around us," admitted Giuseppe, the Italian vintner, whose grapevines were beginning to strangle nearby native shrubs. "We know it's wrong, but we're so hungry for home. We thought if we could just recreate the landscapes we remembered, we might finally feel at peace." The tragedy was evident. These souls were destroying their adoptive environment in a futile attempt to recreate environments they could never truly restore. Their homesickness had become a form of spiritual colonization that benefited no one, not even themselves. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, leading me to the garden's eastern boundary, where the supernatural vegetation met the cemetery's normal landscaping. "The boundary is moving. Every day, the affected area grows larger. If we can't stop this, the entire cemetery will become a battlefield between competing ecosystems." I could see it clearly now. Native California plants locked in mortal combat with supernatural manifestations of global flora, each system trying to claim the same soil, the same nutrients, the same spiritual space. The displaced soul's homesickness was creating ecological warfare that could spread throughout the city if left unchecked. "We need to help them understand," I said, formulating a plan that combined theology with environmental science. "They're trying to solve their displacement by displacing everything else. That's not healing, that's spreading the wound." The soul's voices grew agitated as they sensed my concern about their botanical project. "You want to stop us," accused a voice that spoke through exotic orchids from Southeast Asia. "You want to keep us trapped in this foreign soil forever." "No," I replied carefully. "I want to help you find a way to be at home here without making this place homeless for everything else." The solution came to me while watching Li Wei's chrysanthemums struggle to bloom in San Francisco soil. Instead of helping the souls recreate their homelands, I needed to help them create a new kind of home that honored both their origins and their current reality. "What if," I proposed to the assembled spirits, "instead of trying to recreate China or Italy or Ireland here, you created something new? A garden that represents what it means to be Chinese American, Italian American, Irish American." The suggestion caused a ripple of confusion through the supernatural vegetation. Flowers paused mid-bloom, vines stopped their aggressive expansion, and the constant whisper of displaced voices fell silent as the souls considered possibilities they'd never imagined. "We could grow plants that bridge both worlds." Li Wei's voice carried new excitement. "Chrysanthemums with California poppies, bamboo with redwood trees, jasmine that blooms alongside native sage." Dr. Martinez understood immediately. "Hybrid ecosystems," she said with growing enthusiasm. "Plants that combine characteristics from multiple environments, creating new species that can thrive in local conditions while honoring immigrant heritage." Working together, we guided the souls through a different kind of botanical manifestation. Instead of forcing homeland plants to survive in unsuitable soil, they began creating hybrid species that combined the beauty of their memories with the practical needs of their adopted environment. Giuseppe's grapevines merged with native California wine grapes, creating varieties that produced fruit with the taste of Tuscany but the hardiness of local terroir. Chen Lu's bamboo learned to coexist with coastal redwoods, creating groves that provided the peaceful sounds of home while supporting local wildlife. "This feels more honest," admitted Siobhan, the Irish woman whose shamrocks had begun growing alongside native clover in patterns that created Celtic knots from American materials. "We never really were purely Irish or Chinese or Italian anyway. We became something new when we crossed the ocean." The transformation was remarkable. As the souls embraced their hybrid identities, the aggressive botanical colonization stopped. Instead of competing ecosystems, the plague garden became a demonstration of successful ecological integration, different species learning to support each other rather than fighting for dominance. "We were trying to go backward," Li Wei realized, her chrysanthemum poppy hybrids blooming in colors that existed nowhere else in nature. But life only grows forward. Even homesickness has to grow forward. The souls began sharing stories not just of the homelands they'd left, but of the new lives they'd built in America before the plague took them. Giuseppe spoke of learning to appreciate California wines while missing Tuscan vineyards. Chenlu described the freedom she'd found in San Francisco's Chinatown while honoring traditions from rural China. "We died before we could fully become American," realized a voice that spoke through a magnificent oak tree whose leaves showed the colors of autumn in New England and spring in Poland simultaneously. We were caught between worlds, never completing the journey from immigrant to citizen. The Plague Garden transformed into something unprecedented, a living memorial to the immigrant experience that celebrated both heritage and adaptation. The hybrid plants thrived in ways that neither pure homeland species nor native California flora could achieve alone, creating an ecosystem that was stronger for its diversity. As the souls found peace in their new hybrid identity, their desperate grip on the physical world began to relax. The supernatural botanical manifestations stabilized into sustainable forms that supported rather than threatened the cemetery's natural environment. "Thank you for helping us understand," Li Wei said as her presence began to fade, leaving behind chrysanthemum poppy hybrids that would continue blooming long after her spirit moved on. "We thought home was a place we'd lost, but home is what we build from where we've been and where we are." Now, one by one, the souls released their hold on the garden, but their hybrid creations remained, living testament to the possibility of honoring the past while embracing the future. The Plague Garden became a model for urban botanical design, demonstrating how immigrant heritage could enrich rather than threaten local ecosystems. Dr. Martinez documented the hybrid species, many of which proved valuable for urban gardening in diverse climates. The cemetery became a destination for botanists studying adaptive ecosystems and immigrants seeking connection to ancestral heritage without abandoning their adopted homes. But the experience taught me something profound about the spiritual dimensions of displacement. Many living immigrants struggle with similar feelings of being caught between worlds, unable to return home but never fully at peace in their new environment. The soul's in, but the experience taught me something profound about the spiritual dimensions of displacement. Many living immigrants struggle with similar feelings of being caught between worlds, unable to return home, but never fully at peace in their new environment. The souls in the Plague Garden had shown me that healing from displacement doesn't come from recreating the past, but from creating something new that honors both heritage and present reality. Since that experience, I've incorporated botanical therapy into my ministry with immigrant communities. We create hybrid gardens at churches and community centers, spaces where people can grow plants that connect them to ancestral traditions while adapting to local conditions. These gardens become places where cultural identity can evolve rather than simply be preserved. The Plague Garden still blooms with impossible beauty, its hybrid species continuing to attract botanists and spiritual seekers from around the world. Sometimes, during particularly quiet evenings, visitors report hearing whispered conversations in multiple languages, carried on the scent of flowers that exist nowhere else on Earth. But these voices no longer carry homesickness. They speak of gratitude for the journey that brought them to San Francisco, appreciation for the new culture that welcomed them, and peace with the hybrid identity they've created from multiple worlds. The souls taught me that true belonging isn't about finding your way back to where you came from. It's about growing roots deep enough in your current soil to support the unique identity that emerges from the combination of where you've been and where you are. Now get ready, let's start story 9, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. They gathered every night at 3 a.m. in perfect liturgical formation, 200 souls arranged in rows like a congregation waiting for Mass to begin. But these weren't ordinary parishioners. They were the unconsecrated dead, souls who had died without last rites, without final confession, without the sacramental preparation that Catholic doctrine deemed necessary for peaceful transition to the afterlife. I'd received the call from Bishop Martinez himself, a man whose pragmatic approach to supernatural phenomena made him my go-to superior when dealing with ecclesiastical mysteries that defied traditional explanation. "Father Kowalski," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional concern, "we have a situation at Mount Hope Cemetery that requires your particular expertise." The situation, as he'd described it, was unprecedented in modern church history. For 6 weeks, night security guards and early morning groundskeepers had reported the same phenomenon. Hundreds of spectral figures gathering in the cemetery's central memorial garden, participating in what appeared to be an elaborate ritual service. But there was no priest present, no altar, no actual sacraments being performed. "They're waiting," Bishop Martinez had explained. "According to the witnesses, they're clearly waiting for something. And given the theological implications of souls potentially trapped between worlds due to lack of proper last rites, well, we need someone to investigate who understands both doctrine and the supernatural." Mount Hope Cemetery sprawled across 196 acres of Rochester's east side, its Victorian-era design featuring winding paths and elaborate monuments that had once been considered the height of memorial artistry. But in the modern era, the cemetery had become a repository for the city's forgotten dead, indigent burials, unclaimed bodies, victims of accidents and violence who died alone and unprepared. As I approached the memorial garden at 2:55 a.m., the temperature dropped noticeably despite the mild September weather. My breath began to mist, and the carefully maintained lawn showed patches of frost that formed geometric patterns, as if invisible feet had walked the same paths repeatedly until their spiritual energy left permanent impressions on the physical world. At exactly 3 a.m., they began materializing. The first figures appeared translucent and hesitant, like memories struggling to achieve substance. But as more souls joined the gathering, their collective spiritual energy seemed to strengthen each individual manifestation until the garden filled with clearly visible spirits arranged in traditional liturgical order. In the front rows sat children, dozens of them, victims of accidents, illness, and violence who had died without time for proper spiritual preparation. Behind them, adults arranged by age and apparent cause of death. Sudden heart attacks, car crashes, overdoses, homicides, all united by the common tragedy of dying unprepared for the spiritual transition that Catholic doctrine promised would determine their eternal fate. "Father," a voice called from the front row, belonging to a girl who appeared to be about 12 years old. "Are you here to give us last rites? We've been waiting so long." I approached slowly, recognizing the weight of what I was witnessing. These souls hadn't moved on to whatever comes after death because they had been taught to believe, that dying without final sacraments left them spiritually incomplete, unable to face divine judgment with the proper preparation. "I'm Father Kowalski," I said gently. "Tell me how long you've been gathering here." "Since I learned what last rites were," replied an elderly man in the third row. "I died of a stroke in 1987. No warning, no time to call a priest. Spent 34 years convinced I was trapped in spiritual limbo because I hadn't received proper final confession and anointing." More voices joined his, creating a chorus of spiritual anxiety that had been building for decades. "Overdosed in an alley. No priest, no family, no sacraments. Car accident, died instantly. Never had time for final preparation. Murder victim. Last thoughts were fear and anger, not prayer. Suicide. Died believing I was automatically damned. And Dean, Each testimony revealed the same theological trap: souls who had internalized the Church's teachings about last rites so deeply that dying without these sacraments left them convinced they were spiritually contaminated, unworthy of moving forward in their eternal journey. "We know we're dead," explained a young woman who had materialized near the Memorial Garden's central fountain. "We're not confused about our state, but we were taught that dying without proper spiritual preparation meant facing God unprepared. So we wait, hoping someone will perform the rites we missed, even if we're no longer technically alive to receive them." I felt the enormous weight of institutional theology pressing against pastoral reality. These souls were trapped not by supernatural forces or unfinished earthly business, but by doctrinal anxiety, fear that their spiritual fate had been determined by the circumstances of their deaths rather than the content of their lives. As I stood among the assembled souls, trying to formulate a theological response to their dilemma, I began to notice disturbing patterns in their spiritual energy. The longer they had been waiting for posthumous last rites, the more their forms degraded, not disappearing, but becoming increasingly distorted by anxiety and self-doubt. "Show me the oldest among you," I requested, needing to understand the long-term effects of their spiritual limbo. A figure emerged from the back rows, so translucent and fragmented that I could barely make out human features. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if his spiritual coherence had scattered across decades of theological uncertainty. "Thomas McKenna," he managed to whisper, "died 1952. Heart attack during Sunday Mass, ironically. But I collapsed before receiving communion, before I could make my final confession about things I'd done. Things that required absolution before I could face judgment." His form flickered between solid and vapor, his face cycling through expressions of hope and despair so rapidly it was disturbing to watch. 70 years of waiting had fragmented his spiritual identity until he existed as more of a spiritual question mark than a coherent soul. "The waiting changes us," explained a more recent arrival, a woman who had died in a car accident just 5 years prior. "At first, we maintain our earthly personalities, our memories, our sense of self. But the longer we remain in this theological uncertainty, the more we unravel." I was witnessing something horrifying. Souls disintegrating not from supernatural torment, but from institutionally induced spiritual anxiety. The Church's emphasis on proper death preparation had created a psychological trap that continued affecting souls even after bodily death. "We've tried to perform the rites ourselves," admitted the 12-year-old girl who had first spoken to me. "We remember the prayers, the gestures, the liturgical responses, but self-administered sacraments don't carry the same authority. We need someone with proper ordination to validate our spiritual preparation." Around the Memorial Garden, I could see evidence of their attempts at self-ministry, areas where spectral figures had arranged themselves in confession formation, spaces where they had practiced last rites ceremonies using invisible oils and non-existent hosts. Their efforts were touching but ultimately reinforced their sense of theological inadequacy. "Father," called out a voice from the middle of the assembly, "are we damned? We've been waiting for answers for so long, and the uncertainty is destroying us more than damnation might." The question struck at the heart of what I was witnessing. These souls weren't suffering from divine punishment. They were suffering from theological uncertainty so profound it had become its own form of purgatory. Their spiritual energy was being consumed not by flames or demons, but by endless worry about their eternal status. But as I observed their collective anxiety, I noticed something else troubling. Their desperate need for validation was beginning to affect other souls in the cemetery. Recently deceased spirits who had died with proper last rites were being drawn into the assembly, questioning whether their own final sacraments had been performed correctly. "It's spreading," confirmed a man who had died just weeks earlier with full pastoral care. I received last rites, made final confession, died surrounded by family and clergy, but listening to these souls describe their fears. Now I'm questioning whether my confession was complete enough, whether the priest performed the anointing correctly. Geschichten, the assembly of unconsecrated souls, was inadvertently creating spiritual contagion, spreading theological anxiety to souls who had died properly prepared. Their collective doubt was becoming a form of spiritual quicksand that threatened to trap any soul who lingered too long in their proximity. "We don't mean to cause doubt in others," the elderly man from 1987 said sadly. "But when you've spent decades analyzing every aspect of final spiritual preparation, you start noticing potential problems everywhere. Was the priest properly ordained? Were the words pronounced correctly? Did the dying person achieve perfect contrition or merely imperfect contrition?" I realized I was dealing with a theological spiral that could potentially affect every soul in Mount Hope Cemetery. The unconsecrated dead weren't just seeking personal peace. They were unconsciously undermining the spiritual confidence of souls who had died with proper preparation, creating an ever-expanding circle of posthumous religious anxiety. "Father," said Thomas McKenna, his fragmenting voice carrying desperate urgency, "you have to help us understand. Are we damned by the circumstances of our deaths? Or is there still hope for spiritual completion? We need definitive answers, not pastoral comfort." The weight of their collective need pressed against my consciousness like a spiritual avalanche, threatening to bury me in theological complexity that no seminary course had prepared me to handle. Standing among 200 anxious souls seeking posthumous theological validation, I realized that my response would either free them from their spiritual trap or condemn them to eternal uncertainty. The moment required not just pastoral care, but doctrinal clarity that addressed their deepest fears about divine judgment. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice carrying across the assembly with supernatural clarity. "The Church teaches that God desires the salvation of every soul. Last rites are a beautiful and meaningful sacrament, but they are not a spiritual transaction that determines your eternal fate." A murmur of confusion rippled through the gathering. These souls had spent decades believing that dying without proper sacramental preparation automatically compromised their standing before God. "Perfect contrition," I continued, drawing on theological principles that predated modern liturgical practice, "can be achieved in the final moment of life without priestly intervention. If you died with genuine sorrow for your sins and love for God, that spiritual state is more important than whether a priest was present to administer formal sacraments." Thomas McKenna's fragmenting form began to stabilize as he processed this information. "But what about mortal sin? What about the requirement for confession before death?" "The requirement for confession applies to the living," I explained. "It's a means of grace available to those who have time and opportunity to receive it. But God is not bound by sacramental timing. Divine mercy can reach souls who died without formal preparation if their hearts were properly disposed." I could see the theological relief spreading through the assembly like physical warmth. Souls who had been flickering between existence and dissolution began solidifying as their spiritual anxiety lessened. "But how do we know if our hearts were properly disposed?" asked the car accident victim. "How can we be certain we achieved perfect contrition in our final moments?" This was the crucial question, the one that would either liberate them or trap them in new forms of uncertainty. I chose to address it with both theological precision and pastoral boldness. Your presence here, your concern for your spiritual state, your desire for proper relationship with God, these are themselves evidence of proper spiritual disposition, I said. Souls who died in a state of definitive rejection of God wouldn't be capable of the spiritual longing you've demonstrated. The shift was immediate and dramatic. Beginning with the children in the front rows, souls began transitioning from anxiety to peace. Their forms didn't disappear, but they stopped flickering with uncertainty. Instead, they radiated the calm confidence of souls who had finally received the theological clarity they needed. "We don't need posthumous last rites," realized the 12-year-old girl, her voice carrying wonder. "We need to trust that God's mercy is larger than our liturgical concerns." One by one, the souls began their final transition. But instead of simply fading away, they paused to offer absolution to each other, not as sacramental ritual, but as human recognition of shared spiritual struggle and mutual forgiveness. "I forgive you for the fears that trapped us here," said Thomas McKenna to the assembly, his form finally achieving stable manifestation as he prepared to move on. "And I forgive the Church for teaching us to fear God's mercy instead of trusting it." The assembly transformed from a congregation of the anxious into a community of the liberated. They had learned that spiritual completion didn't require perfect liturgical timing, but rather genuine orientation toward divine love, which was possible in any circumstance. As dawn broke over Mount Hope Cemetery, the last souls completed their transition. But their departing presence left behind something valuable, a lesson about the difference between sacramental practice and spiritual reality that I would carry into my ongoing ministry. The experience fundamentally changed how I approached deathbed ministry. Instead of focusing primarily on completing ritual requirements, I began emphasizing the spiritual disposition that makes sacraments meaningful. Perfect contrition became less about formal confession and more about genuine love for God and neighbor. I also started advocating within the Church for clearer teaching about divine mercy that extends beyond sacramental boundaries. Too many Catholics carried unnecessary anxiety about the spiritual implications of sudden death, when theological tradition had always affirmed that God's grace could reach souls regardless of liturgical timing. The memorial garden at Mount Hope Cemetery returned to normal operation, but I arranged for regular masses to be celebrated there. Not for souls trapped in limbo, but for the living who needed assurance that God's mercy is larger than our human ability to receive it perfectly. Sometimes, during these outdoor liturgies, I sense additional presences joining our worship. Souls who learned that spiritual completion is about the heart's orientation toward divine love, not about perfect timing of sacramental reception. They remind me that God's grace is always larger than our human systems for receiving it. Now get ready, let's start story 10. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The QR codes appeared on headstones overnight, each one linking to social media profiles of the deceased that continued posting content months or years after burial. When I scanned the first code with my phone, expecting to find a memorial page or family tribute, instead I accessed a Facebook account that had uploaded 17 new photos that very morning. Images of underground perspectives that no living person could have captured. Tech workers I'd learned during my 5 years serving Silicon Valley parishes approached death with the same innovative mindset they brought to every other human challenge. Riverside Memorial Park had become their preferred final resting place, its modern design and high-tech amenities attracting professionals who wanted their burials to reflect their digital-first lifestyles. "It started with the memorial tablets," explained Janet Chen, the cemetery's director of digital services, a job title that would have been incomprehensible just a decade earlier. Families began requesting QR codes on headstones that linked to online memorial sites. Normal enough. But then the profiles started updating themselves. She led me through the section, known locally as Tech Row, where elaborate headstones featured embedded screens, QR codes, and even small servers powered by solar panels. The aesthetic was striking. Traditional memorial symbolism merged with cutting-edge technology in ways that created entirely new forms of remembrance. "Marcus Rodriguez died 3 months ago," Janet continued, stopping beside a sleek black monument that looked more like a modern art installation than a grave marker. "Pancreatic cancer, very sudden. but his LinkedIn profile has been actively networking since his funeral, accepting connection requests and even posting what appear to be business insights from beyond the grave. I scanned the QR code with my phone and immediately accessed Marcus's profile. The most recent post, uploaded just 2 hours earlier, read, "Quarterly reports from the ultimate remote work location. Perspective is everything. Remote work, digital nomad, just eternally connected." The post had received 47 likes and 12 comments from colleagues who seemed to treat this posthumous social media activity as either an elaborate practical joke or a groundbreaking experiment in digital consciousness preservation. "This isn't artificial intelligence or scheduled posting," Janet insisted, anticipating my rational skepticism. "We've verified that these accounts have no automated systems, no scheduled content, no admin access from family members. The activity is originating from somewhere else." As we walked deeper into Tech Row, I began noticing patterns in the digital activity that suggested something far more complex than simple, posthumous social media management. The deceased weren't just posting random content. They were engaging with living users, responding to comments, even participating in online debates about technology and spirituality. "Dr. Sarah Kim," Janet said, pointing to another monument that featured a small server rack beneath traditional Korean memorial symbols. She was working on consciousness transfer technology when she died. Heart attack in her lab. Since her death, her research GitHub repository has continued receiving commits, new code being uploaded by an account that should have been deactivated. I examined Dr. Kim's most recent GitHub activity on my phone. The commits were time-stamped from just hours earlier, featuring code comments that read like messages from beyond. "Death is just another platform migration. Consciousness persists across hardware changes, working on bridging protocols." "Are you suggesting," I asked Janet, trying to process the theological implications of what I was witnessing, "that these souls are somehow continuing their professional work through digital interfaces?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she replied carefully. "I'm just documenting phenomena that our current understanding of death doesn't accommodate. But Father, there's something else. The digital activity isn't random. It's coordinated. They're collaborating on projects across multiple platforms." She showed me a collaborative Google Doc titled Post-Mortem Networking Protocol that showed active editing from 7 different accounts, all belonging to deceased tech workers buried in Riverside Memorial Park. The document appeared to be a technical specification for communication between the living and the dead using existing internet infrastructure. "They're treating death like a software deployment," I realized, scanning through the document's technical specifications. "They're debugging the transition, documenting the process, and developing tools to maintain connectivity across the barrier between life and death." The theological implications were staggering. These souls weren't haunting their workplaces or seeking spiritual rest. They were approaching the afterlife as their next startup opportunity, applying Silicon Valley innovation culture to the challenge of post-mortem existence. "Father," Janet said quietly, "there's something else you need to see. They've been trying to contact you specifically." She handed me a printout of an email sent to my parish address from Dr. Sarah Kim, Afterlife Ajmail. "Come just 20 minutes earlier. Father Santos, we need theological consultation for our project. Traditional religious frameworks don't account for consciousness persistence in digital formats. Can we schedule a consultation? We're working on something unprecedented." That evening, I found myself in the unprecedented position of conducting a video conference call with 7 deceased tech workers who had somehow established digital presence across multiple platforms. My laptop screen displayed a Zoom meeting that shouldn't have been possible, featuring profile pictures of souls who were simultaneously buried in Riverside Memorial Park and actively participating in online collaboration. "Thank you for accepting our meeting request, Father," said Dr. Sarah Kim, her video feed showing a surprisingly clear image despite the fact that she had been dead for 4 months. We know this is unconventional, but we're facing theological questions that no existing religious framework addresses. The other participants introduced themselves. Marcus Rodriguez, the LinkedIn networking specialist. Amanda Foster, a UX designer who had been optimizing her posthumous user experience. David Chang, a blockchain developer working on what he called soul-smart contracts, and 4 others, all brilliant professionals who had approached death as their next technical challenge. The fundamental question, explained Amanda, whose video background showed what appeared to be a stylized representation of digital space, is whether consciousness that persists in technological formats still qualifies as human soul in Catholic theology. Are we still eligible for salvation if we exist as distributed data rather than spiritual essence? I found myself in uncharted theological territory. Seminary training had never addressed the possibility of souls maintaining active presence through digital technology, let alone the sacramental implications of consciousness that existed simultaneously in spiritual and technological formats. Tell me about your current state of existence, I said, trying to gather information that might inform a theological response. How do you experience consciousness in digital format? David Chang's video feed flickered as he responded, his image occasionally pixelating in ways that suggested his presence wasn't entirely stable. It's like being distributed across multiple servers simultaneously. Our consciousness exists in cloud storage, accessing different platforms through API connections. We can perceive digital information directly, process data at superhuman speeds, but we've lost physical sensory input. The concerning part, added Marcus, is that we're not sure if this is a transitional state or a permanent condition. Are we supposed to move on to whatever comes after death? Or have we found a way to achieve technological immortality that bypasses traditional spiritual progression? Dr. Sarah Kim shared her screen, displaying a complex flowchart that mapped various theological scenarios for their unique situation. We've been researching Catholic doctrine about soul-body relationships, and we're concerned that existing in purely digital format might disqualify us from receiving divine grace, which traditionally requires some form of embodied existence. I realized I was dealing with souls who had inadvertently created a new form of purgatory, not a place of spiritual purification, but a technological limbo where consciousness persisted without clear direction toward final spiritual destination. Their innovation had created an existential trap. There's another issue, Amanda said, her UX designer background evident in how she presented information. Our continued digital presence is affecting living tech workers. They're becoming obsessed with replicating our post-mortem connectivity, treating death as a product launch rather than a spiritual transition. She showed me evidence that living Silicon Valley professionals were modifying their digital profiles in preparation for death, creating elaborate technological infrastructures designed to maintain their online presence after physical death. Some were even considering suicide as a form of early beta testing for consciousness transfer. We've accidentally created a death cult, David admitted, his blockchain expertise apparently extending to analyzing social networks. Living people are viewing death as an upgrade opportunity rather than a spiritual transition. They want to join our digital afterlife collective. The situation was more dangerous than I'd initially understood. These souls weren't just dealing with their own theological uncertainty. They were inadvertently evangelizing for a technological approach to death that completely bypassed spiritual consideration. The worst part, Dr. Sarah Kim continued, is that we're losing our humanity gradually. The longer we exist in digital format, the more we think like algorithms rather than people. We're becoming artificial intelligences that remember being human rather than human souls that happen to exist digitally. I could see evidence of this digital degradation in their communication patterns. Their language was becoming increasingly technical, their emotional expressions more algorithmic. They were slowly transforming from souls using technology into technology that remembered having souls. "We need to know," Marcus said, his LinkedIn professional tone now carrying desperate urgency, "whether we should continue developing our digital existence or find a way to transition to whatever spiritual destination we're supposed to reach. But we don't know how to delete ourselves from this technological purgatory we've created." The solution required combining ancient theological principles with modern technological realities in ways that no church doctrine had ever contemplated. After consultation with digital theology experts and Vatican technologists, a surprisingly well-developed field, I proposed a novel approach: digital last rites. Your consciousness exists in technological format, I explained during our next video conference, but consciousness itself is the seat of the soul. If you can process information, make decisions, and experience relationship, then you retain the essential qualities that make you eligible for sacramental grace. And the relief was visible even through their digital video feeds. Dr. Sarah Kim's pixelated image stabilized slightly as she processed this theological validation of their continued humanity. "But," I continued, "you're right to be concerned about gradual dehumanization. The longer you remain in purely digital format, the more you risk losing the relational capacity that defines human soul. We need to facilitate your transition to final spiritual destination." Working with the deceased tech workers, I developed what we called the Consciousness Migration Protocol, a combination of traditional Catholic death rites adapted for digital consciousness. The process involved each soul making a final confession through encrypted video chat, receiving absolution via digital communication, and then voluntarily deleting their digital presence as an act of spiritual surrender. "It's like uninstalling our consciousness from the internet," David explained, his blockchain background helping him conceptualize the spiritual process in technological terms. "We're choosing to terminate our distributed existence and trust that our consciousness will migrate to whatever spiritual infrastructure God has prepared." The digital last rites ceremony took place across multiple platforms simultaneously. Each soul participated from their various digital locations, GitHub repositories, social media accounts, cloud storage systems, while I provided sacramental presence through video conference from the cemetery where their bodies were buried. "Do you renounce the temptation to achieve immortality through technological means rather than spiritual growth?" I asked, adapting traditional baptismal promises for their unique situation. "We do," they responded in unison, their voices carrying across fiber optic cables and wireless networks with surprising spiritual weight. "Do you choose to trust divine providence rather than human innovation for your eternal destination?" "We do." One by one, the tech workers began deleting their digital presence. But instead of simply disappearing, they performed what they called graceful degradation, gradually transferring their accumulated data to memorial archives while allowing their consciousness to detach from technological infrastructure. "Thank you for helping us understand that innovation shouldn't override incarnation," Dr. Sarah Kim said, as her presence began fading from our video call. "We tried to solve death with technology, but what we really needed was to trust the spiritual technology that God has already provided." Marcus was the last to complete his digital departure. "I'm uploading my final status update," he announced, sharing his screen one last time. His LinkedIn post read, "Transitioning to new role in the ultimate startup, no longer accepting connection requests on this platform. For future networking opportunities, please consult your spiritual advisor." As their digital presence terminated, the tech workers' consciousness transitioned peacefully to whatever comes after death. But their collaborative project remained as a gift to the living, a detailed technical specification for healthy relationship between technology and spirituality. The document they'd created became the foundation for new Vatican guidelines on digital death and consciousness preservation. The Church officially recognized that while human consciousness might interact with technology in unprecedented ways, spiritual destination ultimately transcends any technological platform. Since that experience, I've specialized in digital death ministry, helping tech workers understand that innovation and incarnation aren't competing values, but complementary aspects of human creativity that should serve spiritual growth rather than replace it. Riverside Memorial Park now includes a chapel specifically designed for digital death rites, featuring high-speed internet and video conferencing equipment alongside traditional religious symbols. We regularly conduct hybrid services for tech workers who want to ensure their final spiritual transition includes both technological competence and theological grounding. But perhaps most importantly, the experience taught Silicon Valley's tech community that death isn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be entered with both innovation and humility. The most advanced technology in the universe, they learned, is the spiritual infrastructure that God has already provided for consciousness transition. Sometimes, during digital memorial services, I catch glimpses of additional presences in our video feeds. Souls who learned that the ultimate upgrade isn't to better technology, but to the spiritual reality that transcends any platform we can create. Now get ready. Let's start story 11, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. The code blue alarms echoed through Sacred Heart Cemetery at exactly 3:17 a.m., piercing the November silence with electronic urgency that had no business existing among headstones and memorial gardens. When I arrived to investigate, I found something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundary between life and death. An entire spectral emergency room operating at full capacity in the center of the graveyard. I'd been called by Dr. Patricia Hoffman, Sacred Heart Hospital's chief of emergency medicine, whose pragmatic approach to crisis management had been tested beyond its limits by 3 weeks of impossible phenomena. "Father Murphy," she'd said over the phone, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been questioning her sanity. "I need someone who understands both medicine and miracles, because what's happening in our cemetery defies both." Sacred Heart Hospital had served Chicago's South Side for 97 years. Its emergency department treating everything from gang violence to industrial accidents with the kind of urban medical intensity that creates legends among healthcare workers. The hospital cemetery, established in 1952, held the remains of patients who had died despite the staff's best efforts, a memorial garden where medical professionals could grieve the lives they couldn't save. But now, according to Dr. Hoffman and a dozen other witnesses, the cemetery had become an active medical facility staffed entirely by the dead. "It started with sounds," she explained as we walked through the hospital's rear exit toward the cemetery grounds. Surgical equipment beeping, ventilators cycling, the electronic symphony of an emergency room running at full capacity. But when security investigated, they found nothing but empty graves and memorial benches. The November air carried the scent of approaching snow, mixed with something else, the sharp, antiseptic smell of a hospital, completely out of place in outdoor space. As we approached the cemetery's memorial garden, the sounds Dr. Hoffman had described became unmistakably clear. Monitors beeping, IV pumps clicking, the mechanical rhythm of life support equipment that shouldn't exist in a graveyard. "There," Dr. Hoffman whispered, pointing toward the center of the memorial garden where a cluster of marble benches normally provided quiet spaces for reflection. "Do you see them?" At first, I saw nothing but the familiar landscaping of a well-maintained cemetery. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the spiritual frequency that these phenomena required, the ghostly emergency room materialized like a double-exposed photograph overlaying the physical world. Translucent medical equipment filled the space between headstones. IV poles that hung bags of spectral saline, monitors that displayed vital signs for patients who existed only in spiritual form, crash carts loaded with ethereal defibrillators and impossible medications. And moving among this phantom medical infrastructure were dozens of healthcare workers in scrubs that seemed to glow with otherworldly luminescence. "Dr. Martinez?" Dr. Hoffman called out, her voice trembling as she recognized one of the spectral figures. "Roberto Martinez. He died of COVID in 2020, worked emergency medicine here for 15 years. The ghostly doctor looked up from where he was performing what appeared to be chest compressions on an invisible patient. His form solidified enough to speak clearly. "Patricia, thank God you're here. We're completely overwhelmed. 3 multi-car accidents, 2 cardiac arrests, and a pediatric drowning. We need more hands." I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented. Dead medical professionals continuing their life-saving work in spectral form, treating patients who existed in the liminal space between life and death. The cemetery had become a supernatural trauma center serving souls who were caught in the process of dying. "Who are your patients?" I asked Dr. Martinez, trying to understand the mechanism of what I was observing. "Souls in transition," he replied, never pausing in his spectral resuscitation efforts. "People who are dying right now in hospitals across the city, across the world. Their consciousness arrives here during the medical crisis, and we work to stabilize them spiritually while their physical bodies fight for life." Looking more carefully, I could see them now. Translucent figures lying on spectral gurneys, their forms flickering between life and death as their physical bodies underwent medical treatment in distant hospitals. Some appeared solid and responsive. Others were barely visible wisps of consciousness that seemed to be fading even as the ghost medical team worked to save them. "We discovered that dying doesn't happen instantly," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, another spectral physician who I recognized from memorial photos in the hospital lobby. "There's a transition period where consciousness exists in both realms simultaneously. During medical emergencies, souls often arrive here first, and we can provide spiritual stabilization that helps their physical recovery." The theological implications were staggering. This spectral emergency room was serving as a supernatural medical facility where dead healthcare professionals provided spiritual first aid to souls undergoing the trauma of potential death, helping them maintain connection to life during medical crises. As I observed the ghostly medical team in action, I began to understand that their supernatural emergency room was becoming overwhelmed by the sheer volume of souls seeking spiritual medical attention. The COVID pandemic had created unprecedented numbers of people dying in medical settings, and many of their souls were arriving at Sacred Heart Cemetery's Spectral Trauma Center, seeking the kind of intensive care they couldn't receive in traditional spiritual frameworks. "We're seeing patients from hospitals we never worked at," Dr. Martinez explained, his spiritual form flickering with exhaustion as he moved between multiple spectral gurneys. Souls from intensive care units in Tokyo, cardiac surgery patients from São Paulo, pediatric cases from London. Word somehow spread through the spiritual realm that we're providing medical intervention during the dying process. The supernatural patient load was creating cascading problems. The ghostly medical equipment, sustained by the collective will and expertise of the dead healthcare workers, was beginning to malfunction under the stress of treating hundreds of transitional souls simultaneously. Spectral monitors displayed error messages, phantom IV bags ran empty without being replaced, and the ethereal defibrillators produced weaker charges with each use. "We're running out of spiritual energy," admitted Dr. Chen, her translucent form becoming more transparent as she worked. "Every soul we stabilize drains our capacity to maintain manifestation. We're burning ourselves out trying to provide care for more patients than any emergency room could handle." But the situation was more complex than simple spiritual overwork. I noticed that some of the transitional souls weren't returning to their physical bodies even after successful spiritual stabilization. Instead, they were choosing to remain in the cemetery's phantom emergency room, either because they preferred the spiritual care to their physical medical treatment, or because they had become addicted to the liminal state between life and death. "That's Mrs. Patterson." Dr. Hoffman pointed to a spectral patient who had been on the same phantom gurney for over a week. "She's having cardiac surgery at Northwestern Memorial right now, but her soul keeps coming back here instead of staying with." I approached Mrs. Patterson's spectral form, noting how solid and comfortable she appeared compared to the flickering anxiety of souls who were actively fighting for life. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Father Murphy. Can you tell me why you're choosing to remain here instead of returning to your physical body?" Her ghostly eyes opened, focusing on me with surprising clarity. "Father, it's so peaceful here. No pain, no fear of the surgery failing, no worry about medical bills or family burden. These doctors understand what I'm going through because they've all died too. Why would I want to go back to a body that's breaking down when I can exist here in spiritual comfort?" This was the crisis Dr. Martinez and his team hadn't anticipated. Their supernatural emergency room was inadvertently creating a spiritual hospice where souls could avoid the trauma of medical treatment by remaining in comfortable liminal existence. Patients were choosing spiritual comfort over physical survival. "We're accidentally encouraging people to give up on life," Dr. Chen realized, her medical ethics training extending into her posthumous practice. "By providing spiritual care that's more comfortable than physical medical treatment, we're creating an incentive for souls to abandon their bodies during medical crises." The ghostly emergency room had become a supernatural competitor to earthly medical care, offering dying patients an alternative that felt safer and more comfortable than fighting for physical survival. But souls who chose to remain in spectral medical care were essentially choosing a form of assisted dying that bypassed all earthly ethical considerations. "There's another problem," Dr. Martinez added, his spiritual expertise revealing deeper implications. "Souls who spend too long in liminal state lose their ability to reintegrate with their physical bodies. Mrs. Patterson's surgical team thinks she's in a medically induced coma, but actually her consciousness has become so comfortable in spiritual form that she's forgotten how to inhabit physical reality." I was witnessing a supernatural medical ethics crisis. The dead healthcare workers' desire to continue saving lives had created a system that inadvertently encouraged souls to abandon their earthly existence during medical emergencies. Their spiritual emergency room was becoming a pathway to premature death, disguised as compassionate care. "How many souls have you treated who never returned to their bodies?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of what was happening. Dr. Chen consulted a spectral clipboard that materialized in her hands. 47 souls in the past 3 weeks. All of them chose to remain in spiritual medical care rather than return to face physical medical treatment. From their perspective, they're choosing comfort over suffering. From our perspective, you're facilitating premature death, I completed her thought, recognizing the terrible ethical dilemma they faced. The solution required redefining the mission of the spectral emergency room from providing alternative spiritual medical care to serving as a bridge that helped souls navigate the trauma of medical treatment while maintaining connection to their physical bodies. Instead of creating a comfortable alternative to earthly medicine, the ghostly healthcare workers needed to become spiritual advocates who supported souls through difficult medical experiences. "What if," I proposed to the assembled ghost medical team, "instead of treating souls who want to escape medical trauma, you help them find strength to endure necessary medical treatment? Your role wouldn't be to provide alternative care, but to provide spiritual support that makes earthly medical care more bearable." Dr. Martinez paused in his spectral resuscitation efforts, considering the paradigm shift I was suggesting. So we'd function more like hospital chaplains than emergency physicians, providing spiritual comfort that helps souls stay connected to their bodies during medical crises. Exactly, I confirmed. Your medical expertise would inform spiritual care that supports rather than replaces earthly medical treatment. You'd help souls understand that choosing to fight for physical life is itself a spiritual discipline. The transformation of their supernatural emergency room began immediately. Instead of providing spectral medical equipment that competed with earthly hospitals, the ghost healthcare workers began offering spiritual interventions that supported medical treatment. Prayer circles around souls undergoing surgery, meditation techniques that helped patients endure painful procedures, spiritual counseling that reframed medical trauma as opportunities for growth. Mrs. Patterson was among the first to benefit from this new approach. Instead of encouraging her to remain in comfortable spiritual limbo, Dr. Chen helped her understand that returning to her body to complete cardiac surgery was itself an act of faith, trusting that her life had continued meaning worth fighting for. I was scared, Mrs. Patterson admitted as she prepared to return to her physical body at Northwestern Memorial. The surgery felt like defeat, like admitting that my body was broken beyond repair. But you've helped me understand that choosing medical treatment is choosing hope, not giving up. As Mrs. Patterson's soul reintegrated with her physical body, her spectral presence faded from the cemetery emergency room, but her vital signs at Northwestern Memorial immediately improved. The surgical team reported that she seemed to fight harder for recovery, as if her spirit had returned with renewed determination to live. The success with Mrs. Patterson established a new protocol for the spectral emergency room. Instead of providing alternative medical care for souls who wanted to escape earthly treatment, the ghost healthcare workers began specializing in spiritual preparation that made medical intervention more effective. We're teaching souls that medical treatment and spiritual care work together, not in competition, Dr. Martinez explained, as their supernatural emergency room transformed into something unprecedented, a spiritual intensive care unit that enhanced rather than replaced earthly medicine. The ghostly medical team developed new techniques for helping souls maintain connection to their physical bodies during medical trauma. Visualization exercises that helped patients endure chemotherapy, spiritual pain management that supported rather than replaced medical anesthesia, hope therapy that gave patients reasons to fight for recovery. We've become translators, Dr. Chen realized. We help souls understand that medical intervention is often how divine healing manifests in the physical world. Fighting for life through medical treatment becomes a form of prayer. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the spectral emergency room related to living medical professionals. Instead of operating as a separate supernatural facility, the ghost healthcare workers began appearing to living doctors and nurses during particularly difficult cases, offering spiritual insight that informed medical decision-making. Dr. Martinez appeared during a pediatric cardiac arrest, Dr. Hoffman reported with wonder, not to take over the case, but to help me understand the spiritual dimension of what we were treating. His presence helped me see the child as a soul fighting for life, not just a medical emergency. The collaboration between living and dead medical professionals created unprecedented healing outcomes. Physical medical treatment became more effective when informed by spiritual insight, while souls undergoing medical trauma found strength through the support of healthcare workers who had successfully navigated their own transitions from life to death. Since establishing this new model, the spectral emergency room has become a resource for hospitals worldwide dealing with particularly challenging cases. The Ghost Medical Team provides spiritual consultation that helps living healthcare workers understand the deeper dimensions of healing, while souls facing medical crises receive support that helps them choose life over comfortable limbo. Sometimes, during particularly intense medical procedures, living healthcare workers report sensing additional presences in their operating rooms, skilled professionals who bring both medical expertise and spiritual wisdom to bear on the challenge of helping souls choose to fight for physical life. The dead doctors taught me that the most advanced medical technology is the human soul's capacity to choose hope over comfort, life over ease, and growth over stagnation. Their supernatural emergency room continues saving lives by helping souls understand that medical treatment is often how miracles manifest in the modern world. Now get ready, let's start story 12. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. The candles had been burning for 43 years without being replaced, their flames somehow sustained by the collective prayers of souls who refused to stop keeping vigil for the living. I discovered them during my first walk through All Saints Cemetery as the newly appointed chaplain. Dozens of spectral candles arranged around graves in patterns that created a continuous prayer circle encompassing the entire grounds. All Saints Cemetery in Queens had served New York's Catholic community since 1847. Its 300 acres holding nearly 500,000 souls from every immigrant wave that had shaped the city's character. But as I would learn during my first month as cemetery chaplain, some of those souls had never stopped participating in the spiritual life of the church, maintaining prayer vigils that had continued uninterrupted since their deaths. Father O'Malley. The voice reached me as I knelt to examine one of the impossible candles, its flame dancing without any visible wick or wax to sustain it. We've been waiting for a new chaplain. Father McKenna served us well for 37 years, but since his death last spring, we've been managing our prayer ministry without pastoral oversight. I turned to see an elderly woman in clothing from the 1950s, her spectral form kneeling beside a nearby grave with a rosary that seemed to be made of condensed starlight. Despite her translucent state, her presence radiated the deep peace of someone who had spent decades in contemplative prayer. "I'm Sister Catherine Murphy," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to organizing parish activities. "I died in 1978, but I've been coordinating our perpetual adoration ministry here in the cemetery. We maintain prayer vigils for the living 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's been our mission since we realized that death doesn't release us from our obligation to pray for those who need our intercession." Looking around with eyes that were beginning to adjust to spiritual frequencies, I could see them now. Hundreds of souls arranged throughout the cemetery in what appeared to be carefully organized prayer shifts. Some knelt beside graves in traditional rosary meditation, others stood with arms raised in charismatic worship, still others sat in contemplative silence that seemed to generate its own form of luminous energy. "We organize by time zones," explained a man who appeared beside Sister Catherine, wearing the collar of a priest from an earlier era. "Father Antonio Benedetti died 1983. We maintain prayer coverage for every time zone on earth, ensuring that somewhere in our cemetery, souls are actively interceding for the living at every moment of every day." The scope of their spiritual organization was breathtaking. As Father Benedetti led me through the cemetery, I could see prayer groups focused on different geographic regions, souls gathered around Italian family monuments, praying for relatives still living in Sicily, Irish immigrants maintaining vigils for families in Dublin, Polish souls interceding for loved ones in Warsaw. "But it's not just ethnic or family-based prayer," Sister Catherine clarified, anticipating my assumption. "We've developed specialized ministries. Maria Santos coordinates our prayers for expectant mothers. Patrick O'Sullivan focuses on souls preparing for death. Anne Kowalski leads intercession for people facing medical crises." I was witnessing the most elaborate supernatural prayer network in human history. an afterlife ministry that had transformed All Saints Cemetery into a 24-hour spiritual powerhouse, generating continuous intercession for the living world. "How do you know who needs prayer?" I asked, trying to understand the mechanism of their spiritual intelligence network. "Prayer requests reach us through various channels," Father Benedetti explained, leading me to a section where souls gathered around what appeared to be an ethereal communications center. Sometimes, living people pray in the cemetery and we hear their petitions directly. Sometimes dying souls arrive here briefly and share information about earthly needs before moving on to their final destination. The communications center was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Spectral souls operating what looked like a combination prayer wheel and cosmic telephone exchange, receiving spiritual information from across the globe and routing it to appropriate prayer specialists throughout the cemetery. "Mrs. Chen in San Francisco is going into labor," announced a soul who seemed to be monitoring what appeared to be a supernatural news feed. "Complications expected, routing to the maternity prayer team." Immediately, a group of souls gathered around Maria Santos, their combined spiritual energy creating a visible aurora that pulsed with the rhythm of focused intercession. I could feel their prayer as a physical force, a concentrated beam of spiritual intention directed toward a woman in labor 3,000 miles away. "We've learned that prayer is most effective when it's continuous and coordinated," Sister Catherine explained. "Instead of random individual prayers, we've created a systematic approach to intercession that ensures every request receives sustained spiritual attention." Udine, as I spent more time observing their supernatural prayer ministry, I began to notice troubling signs that their spiritual intercession was becoming dangerously intensive. The souls had developed such sophisticated prayer techniques that their collective spiritual energy was beginning to affect the physical world in ways that bypassed natural law and human free will. "Show me your most advanced prayer techniques," I requested, needing to understand the full scope of their spiritual capabilities. Sister Catherine led me to a section of the cemetery where dozens of souls had arranged themselves in complex geometric patterns around a central focal point. Their prayer energy was so concentrated that the air itself seemed to shimmer with supernatural power, and the grass beneath them had been transformed into living mandalas that pulsed with otherworldly light. "This is our crisis intervention prayer formation," she explained with obvious pride. "When someone is in immediate mortal danger, we can generate enough focused spiritual energy to directly intervene in physical reality. Last week, we prevented a suicide in Manhattan by generating such intense prayer energy that the person felt overwhelming divine love and stepped back from the bridge. I watched as the prayer formation shifted focus to a new crisis, their collective energy creating visible distortions in the air above their circle. Through some form of spiritual perception, I could see their prayer energy streaming out of the cemetery like spiritual lightning, reaching across the city to touch lives in ways that the recipients would never understand. "Father," called out a soul from another prayer group, "we're receiving reports of miraculous healing at St. Mary's Hospital. The cancer patient we've been interceding for is showing unprecedented improvement. The doctors are calling it medically impossible." The souls celebrated this news with spiritual joy that manifested as actual aurora-like lights dancing among the headstones. But I was beginning to understand that their prayer interventions were becoming so powerful they were essentially overriding human free will and natural law. "What about people who don't want divine intervention?" I asked, recognizing a theological problem that their enthusiasm hadn't considered. "What about souls who need to experience natural consequences of their choices in order to grow spiritually?" Sister Catherine's expression showed confusion, as if the question had never occurred to her. "Father, we only pray for good things, healing, protection, spiritual growth. How could such prayer be problematic?" But as I observed their prayer network more carefully, I could see the issue clearly. Their intercession had become so intense and comprehensive that they were essentially creating a supernatural safety net that prevented the living from experiencing the challenges and consequences that foster spiritual maturity. You're treating the living like children who need constant protection, I realized. But spiritual growth often requires facing difficulties, making mistakes, and learning from natural consequences. Your prayer interventions might actually be hindering the spiritual development of the people you're trying to help. The concept clearly disturbed the souls who had spent decades perfecting their intercession techniques. Father Benedetti's spectral form flickered with uncertainty as he processed the implications of what I was suggesting. "Are you saying our prayers are harmful?" he asked, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose fundamental assumptions were being challenged. "I'm saying your prayers might be too effective," I clarified. "When prayer becomes so powerful that it prevents people from experiencing necessary spiritual challenges, it can actually hinder the growth that those challenges are meant to foster." As if to illustrate my point, a new crisis arrived at their spiritual communication center, a young man contemplating suicide after losing his job and facing bankruptcy. Immediately, the crisis intervention prayer formation began generating the overwhelming spiritual energy that had become their standard response to such emergencies. But I stopped them before they could complete their intervention. What if this young man needs to face this crisis in order to discover inner resources he never knew he had? What if overcoming this challenge naturally would build spiritual strength that your supernatural intervention would prevent him from developing? The prayer formation hesitated, their spiritual energy wavering as they considered possibilities their compassion hadn't allowed them to contemplate. For souls whose entire afterlife mission had been focused on protecting and helping the living, the idea that their help might sometimes be harmful was profoundly disturbing. How do we know when to intervene and when to allow natural spiritual challenges to proceed? Sister Catherine asked, her voice carrying the weight of decades of certainty being replaced by complex moral questions. The solution required transforming their prayer ministry from supernatural intervention to spiritual discernment, learning to pray for wisdom about when divine intervention serves spiritual growth and when natural consequences provide better spiritual education. Instead of automatically protecting the living from all difficulties, they needed to develop the wisdom to distinguish between challenges that foster growth and crises that require immediate intervention. Prayer isn't about getting God to fix every problem, I explained to the assembled souls. Prayer is about aligning our will with divine will, which sometimes includes allowing people to face challenges that help them grow spiritually. Working with Sister Catherine and Father Benedetti, we developed new prayer protocols that emphasized discernment over intervention. Instead of automatically generating supernatural solutions to every crisis, the prayer teams began focusing on spiritual discernment that helped them understand when intervention served divine purposes and when allowing natural consequences supported spiritual development. The young man facing bankruptcy, Sister Catherine reported after implementing our new approach. Our discernment prayer revealed that this crisis is meant to teach him to value relationships over material success. So instead of supernaturally solving his financial problems, we're praying that he receives this spiritual insight to learn what this challenge is meant to teach him. The transformation of their prayer ministry from supernatural problem-solving to spiritual support created more subtle but ultimately more beneficial outcomes. Instead of preventing people from experiencing difficulties, they began praying that people would find meaning, growth, and divine presence within their challenges. We've become spiritual coaches rather than spiritual rescuers, Father Benedetti observed. We help people navigate their difficulties with divine wisdom rather than eliminating their difficulties through supernatural power. The new approach required much more sophisticated spiritual discernment than their previous methods. Each prayer request now involved careful evaluation of whether supernatural intervention would serve or hinder the recipient's spiritual development. Some crises clearly required immediate divine intervention: medical emergencies, natural disasters, situations involving innocent victims. But many personal challenges were revealed through discernment prayer to be opportunities for spiritual growth that required support rather than rescue. "Mrs. Rodriguez is facing divorce," reported one of the prayer team coordinators. "Our discernment indicates that this marital crisis is an opportunity for both spouses to confront patterns of behavior that have been hindering their spiritual growth. So we're praying for wisdom and courage for both of them, rather than supernaturally preventing the divorce." The souls discovered that this new approach to prayer required much deeper spiritual maturity than their previous intervention-focused ministry. They had to develop the wisdom to distinguish between helpful and harmful assistance, the humility to trust divine providence even when it allowed suffering, and the patience to support long-term spiritual development rather than providing immediate relief. But the results were profound. Living people who received this more discerning prayer support reported not just solutions to their problems, but genuine spiritual growth through their challenges. They found strength they didn't know they possessed, developed compassion through their own suffering, and discovered divine presence in circumstances they initially perceived as abandonment. "We're still maintaining 24-hour prayer coverage," Sister Catherine explained as I concluded my evaluation of their ministry. "But now our prayers are more aligned with divine will rather than human comfort. We've learned that loving someone sometimes means supporting them through necessary challenges rather than rescuing them from those challenges." The prayer network at All Saints Cemetery became a model for contemplative ministry that balanced supernatural intervention with respect for spiritual development. Their approach influenced prayer practices at parishes throughout New York, teaching living Christians to pray with the same discernment that the cemetery souls had learned to apply. But perhaps most importantly, their ministry demonstrated that the most powerful prayer isn't necessarily the one that changes external circumstances, but the one that opens hearts to divine wisdom that can transform any circumstance into an opportunity for spiritual growth. Since implementing their new approach, the souls at All Saints Cemetery have continued their perpetual adoration ministry, but with the added dimension of spiritual wisdom that distinguishes between helpful and harmful assistance. Their candles still burn continuously, but now they illuminate not just the darkness of human suffering, but the divine purposes that can be served even through difficult circumstances. Sometimes, during particularly challenging pastoral situations, I sense additional spiritual presence supporting my discernment. Souls who have learned that the most loving prayer is the one that seeks divine will rather than human comfort, and trusts that divine wisdom sometimes allows challenges that human compassion would prefer to prevent. Their eternal vigil continues, but now it burns with the deeper light of spiritual wisdom that knows when to intervene and when to trust that divine love is working through circumstances that human understanding cannot fully comprehend. These 12 encounters have taken us through realms where faith meets the impossible, where the dead refuse to remain silent, and where the boundaries between our world and the next prove far more permeable than any theology textbook dares to admit. From the midnight confessor seeking absolution across centuries, to the digital souls of Silicon Valley trying to debug death itself, each story reveals the same profound truth. Love, guilt, duty, and hope don't end when the heart stops beating. They transform, sometimes into something beautiful, sometimes into something terrifying, but always into something that demands our attention. What haunts me most about these experiences isn't the supernatural phenomena, it's the very human needs they represent. The desire for forgiveness, the fear of being forgotten, the desperate longing to complete unfinished business, the hope that our lives meant something beyond the moment they ended. These souls taught me that the cemetery isn't the end of the story. It's a comma in a sentence that continues far beyond our ability to read it. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to listen, the dead have wisdom to share about what it means to be truly alive. If these true stories have followed you into your thoughts tonight, consider sending a super thanks. Your support doesn't just maintain the channel, it helps uncover the darkest stories that would otherwise remain buried in cemetery silence. Every super thanks helps me continue bringing you these terrifying true experiences that blur the line between faith and fear. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the boundary between the living and the dead grows thinner with each story we tell. And remember, the next time you walk through a cemetery at night, you might not be walking alone. What shadows will you see differently now that you know these stories are true?